All right. Welcome to the live program. I appreciate you guys being here. Now, as many of you know, I did a debate with Jeremiah Nortier in Jonesboro, Arkansas, over a Calvinistic issue. It's the issue of free will, over libertarian free will. And, of course, I posted the debate. I've had lots of views, lots of comments, lots of responses. I appreciate all those. And I posted a few clips from the debate, as did Jeremiah. But also, we have tonight a response to a review that he did with David Lewis. So David Lewis and him, both of them are Reformed theologians. They talked about the debate and had several comments. Of course, I was in the side chat having fun. I had a lot to say. They invited me on there, and I made sure that was okay. I wasn't trying to blow up the side chat. But nevertheless, I've got the video, and we will play it and have our own responses to their review. So that's what we will do tonight.
It's easy to get discouraged and think it's never going to work out.
Knowing that there is
Okay, so, actually I was going to have a guest come on and help me review the JP. He's a friend of the program. He's been on several times. Actually, he comes on and helps us review. And so, but he wasn't able to do it, and it just kind of time is going by, so he said just go ahead and do it. So I'm flying solo on the review. I did want to have a JP on. But nevertheless, I think we can get some good information out of this. So, as always, I'm going to ask you to give me some audio feedback. Hopefully we'll have no problems there. Now, so let me set it up a bit, okay? So, David Lewis invited me to come watch. I did. I was in the side chat, and I was just commenting. I had the time. Or at least I made the time. And I was commenting right and left. And I even made sure here and there that, hey, we're having fun here. This isn't me trying to blow it up, and I even made sure that was okay with David. If you ever watch it, you'll see my comments saying, hey, I just want you to know I'm not trying to blow up the comments or something here. But, I was just commenting. And I was trying to give them a little grief so that I could get in because they were saying things, and I thought, why don't you just let me in? So I was being a little persistent. But it's okay. I understand sometimes, when I have a guest, I don't let just anybody and everybody call in. By the way, the phone number is there if you want to call in. If you call in, get to the point, and we'll keep it rolling. But so, by the way, David Lewis, if he happens to tune in, David, you are more than welcome to call in and comment. And Jeremiah as well, but I think Jeremiah said he wouldn't be able to make it. All right, but anyway, so they're responding to this. And they got their comments about the debate. Now, if you haven't seen the debate, if you haven't watched it, I don't know. You may not, some things might not click here for you. But it doesn't matter. You don't have to come back and watch later. That you can do that. But this will make sense. We'll make sense of it anyway, so just keep tuning in. All right, so we're going to start kind of the beginning, and we might skip along depending on what's going on in the time, okay? So now I'm going straight to David's channel where this was recorded. Or stream. This is Apologetics from the Attic. That's David Lewis' website. Joey Chapa, nice to see you. And Jamie, nice to see you in the side chat. So, again, feedback on the audio would be good, and any other feedback will be good as well. So let's just go ahead and begin. Again, from the YouTube page of Apologetics from the Attic. That's David Lewis. Here we go.
Everyone who doesn't know what we're doing.
Okay. So I should comment. I did speed this up. I sped it up 1.5. So it's a little fast, but I think we can still listen to it pretty well.
Jeremiah debated AK Richardson. I hope AK tunes in and jumps in the comments. I tagged him on stuff, and he knows this is going on.
Oh, yeah. So he has some ongoing questions for me. I watched his debate review the other night, and I loved it.
Yeah, he let me on there for for 20, and then and AK, if you're listening, you edited my phone call. You didn't play the whole context, the whole phone call.
Oh, got him.
But it was fine. It was cool. So it was just.
All right, so I just commented on that, although that's not relevant to the content per se. Now, he does say a little bit later when he sees me comment on that, he says, no, I was just joking. Okay, fair enough, but it didn't sound like a joke. Now, what I did now, David Lewis called in on my review. We had a good chat, and we talked about different topics. I mean, they were all related, but they were distinct topics, and I chose a portion of the phone call that I wanted to play for everybody on its own clip, and I posted that video. I did not edit within the portion, and the comments that were made before and after were not all that significant, or the subjects we talked about. We talked about how debating should happen, some things about Jeremiah. I asked David before the portion I put if he thinks people understood Jeremiah, but the portion I wanted to get to was the portion I posted. So I was a little bit taken back by that because it wasn't out of context. I mean, the context was supplied. I did not edit within the portion of the phone call. But he says later on he was joking. So, okay.
It's called the free will debate. And I thought what we could do is we could just review the debate. And I have a whole bunch of timestamps in front of me. And just go through some of his points and just go back and forth. And then anyone that's watching, I'm not super hardcore live streamer here, Jeremiah, just so you know.
We'll
be lucky to get 10 people.
You have an incredible backdrop. I'm kind of jealous of all that going on back there.
Yeah, like those busts. See that Augustine, Luther, Calvin bust above my head? It's legit.
Now, that green commentary, is that Owen?
No, that's Spurgeon. Those are Spurgeon sermons.
We have that.
No, you're talking about the white and green?
I'm going to skip ahead. David's going to read from some theologian that doesn't interest me too much, and then we'll get to it.
The one flatters natural pride. The other is a gospel for penitent public. The one, however, conforming to them to reason. The other subject categories to try to understand it, like the categorical ability, like you were talking about, and that kind of stuff. Which AK in his debate review was basically like, well, nobody understood anything he was saying. I'm like, that's a little. No, I don't think it was.
They act like I was making these things up out of thin air.
Yeah, and you weren't. Oh, AK's on.
Yes, AK's in the building.
Bam.
Round 2, baby.
Oh, AK, you got to get a better picture on there, bro, with your beard, bro. What's going on? Oh wow, he's already blowing up the chat. Oh my god. Okay. But he's already.
I was just, I had a lot to say there, but having fun the whole time. Now, this idea about nobody understanding what he said, well, I mean, obviously there were some, I'm sure, who have studied it, but most people did not understand. I'm sure of it. You see, here's the thing. When you are debating people, now his position isn't all that different from other compatibilists. But depending on who you're talking to or debating, they're going to be explaining it with different terminology. And he chose, and it's true, he did not make up these categories. I believe somebody did, and I don't believe they ultimately mean anything, but he did not make up the terms on his own. But categorical ability and all these other things. And so, I think it's true. I think most of the audience did not follow him. And you don't want that to be a big part of your discussion where most people are not following most of it. But, I think that's just a fact.
Talking about the edited part. I don't think he took that as a joke. Yes, by edited, I chose a portion that was a good subject. I'm sorry. AK, I was messing with you. That was a joke. What were we saying? Okay, let's just go back to...
Ground up versus
top
down.
That part. Okay, yeah, so the top-down part, okay, like a guy like Tim Stratton, you know what I'm saying, like a Molinist, and he's got his opinions on stuff, but as far as but this is the problem with these type of guys are latent. Like, I never hear them do episodes on, like, what is the gospel? It's just always about attacking Calvinism, right? But I'm assuming that those guys, and AK would be included in this, that we agree on the gospel. But I want to show people that this issue...
Now, he didn't mention my name. He mentioned several people, I think, that, several people that are not Calvinists and post material against Calvinist and Calvinism and Reformed theology. And he said, but I don't ever see a video from them about what is the gospel. Well, I can't answer for them, He didn't mention my name, but I'll just make sure everybody knows. I've got several of those, actually, because for the past year the primary subject I've done is the nature of the gospel and what it is as compared to what mid-Acts dispensationalists say about it. So I've certainly posted those videos. In fact, I haven't done Calvinism up until the point of this debate, except for maybe here and there on certain maybe once saved, always saved, the perseverance of the saints. I have not done much on Calvinism in a long time because I did a lot and then I wanted to take a break. So I obviously would not fit into that, and I can't speak about these other guys. Leighton Flowers, he said Leighton. They mention his name a lot. I'm aware of Leighton Flowers. I've seen his material. I think he's a smart guy. I don't know a whole lot about him. I believe he's a Baptist. I believe I think he believes in once saved, always saved. And this channel, we do not. But he's, from what I understand, he's not an Arminian. So I've seen him, and I've seen him debate some too. So I can't speak for him. But I'm sure there's content out there. Well, I'm just going to speak for myself. I've got plenty of material on the gospel, and I try to do many other subjects than just, combating Calvinist theology. But here we are, because the time is good again to do it because of the debate. And I do plan, Lord willing, to do this series on Calvinism.
Coming from the ground up, if you don't get it right, it destroys the gospel eventually.
Yep.
It destroys the gospel. And you kind of were getting at that when you were, I wish you would have had more time to hammer him on the principle of alternate possibilities thing.
You like that?
Alternate possibilities. And I call that the ought equals can fallacy to help people understand it. It means
100%.
if the Bible says you ought to do something, that means you should have the ability to do it. Mm-hmm. And if you go down that road, you blow up the whole point of the Protestant Reformation, which was Luther. There was stuff in the Bible he ought to do, but he couldn't do it. Right?
Which AK is okay with doing. And like I'm just saying, he's okay with abandoning church history to a degree. Like, I want to be charitable, but I'm going to say a few things more in our episode that I didn't want to bring out in the debate. But I know AK's deeper presuppositions being Church of Christ.
Yeah.
And I told him we wouldn't market it as a Church of Christ debate with the Baptists. Now, he didn't care making it about a Calvinist debate. And I thought, I thought we were going to represent ourselves. But I'm okay. It is what.
Now, I talked to Jeremiah since this review even, and we had a good discussion. We talked about several things. And he asked me if, on this review, he felt that I represented him well, or represented me well. Now, obviously, everybody's going to feel like their arguments are not well represented, even though that kind of just the way it is. But I did tell him, and he was understandable about it. I mentioned this part. I don't believe this is a fair representation at all. He makes it as though I'm just being inconsistent because I did not want to market it as a Church of Christ debate. It isn't, first of all, because the churches of Christ are not unique when it comes to non-Calvinism. I mean, what they believe, except for certain things about original sin and whatnot, is pretty much the same with other non-Calvinists. But, and I said I represent myself because my views don't always align with churches of Christ. Yes, that is a background I have. But I've always said I represent myself. And so he says, well, but he wanted to market this and he wanted to label this as a Calvinism debate. But what he doesn't mention, of course, is that I asked him beforehand. It was just before I started advertising it as a Calvinism debate on my channel, I said, are you okay with this? Are you okay being called a Calvinist? Now, the reason I did that, and I don't always ask, because the fact is this is what Calvinism is, and by and large, they have no problem calling themselves Calvinist. But I did ask that because I said I did not want it marketed as a Church of Christ debate, because it isn't. It's just a debate between what I believe, my theology, which is non-Calvinism, and his, which is Calvinism. But I also thought to ask it in this case because some people just don't. There are Calvinists, at least those who believe like Calvinists, who don't particularly want to be called Calvinists, and that's fine. If they make that known, I will generally try to refrain from calling them Calvinist. But the reality is I was being inconsistent. I did ask him, do you mind being called a Calvinist? This being labeled as a Calvinism debate. And he said, absolutely. And so I believe that he did not represent me well there. He represented me as if I'm being inconsistent, but I absolutely was not. Now, I did tell him that, and he was understandable about it on the phone. But let's move on.
And I want myself to explain to people what I mean.
Yeah.
But Church of Christ are Pelagians. And so that's why I knew I was going to get him on original sin. I was going to make people at least question, like, he's not giving a clear answer if he affirms original sin. And I defined original sin not as total depravity, but as the impossibility of obeying God's law perfectly. Even Leighton Flowers, Tim Stratton.
Yeah, so if Corey Minor doesn't want to be called a Calvinist, fine, but he believes what Calvinists believe. I mean, I've seen what he believes. So yeah, I think that's, some people say they don't like the label. Fine. I don't like the labels of men either. I don't use labels that go by men's names. That's a self-policy I have. I don't mind being called all millennial or something like that. But now, this idea about Pelagian. Now, they are constantly trying to refer to, here's an example. They are constantly trying to refer to their opponents, theologically speaking, as either Pelagian, semi-Pelagian, semi-Pelagian or Pelagian. It is this, and I see this as a continual effort with our Calvinist friends. It is a perpetual and relentless effort to try to associate their opponents with somebody they think other people don't like or agree with so that they can be disqualified by association. I could have a lot to say about Pelagian and what he believed and whatnot. I deny the idea of being a Pelagian. Most Calvinists are fine being called Calvinists, which is why I have no problem using the term.
And those guys are orthodox enough to say, we affirm original sin, the way that the church has always defined it. Now, full-on Pelagians, in order to be consistent with ought equals can, then man possibly can live a sinless life. Pelagius said that. Origen, going back further, said man can sin in heaven. Well, in order to retain...
So none of that represents my view. So I, therefore, will not go by being a Pelagian. I don't believe man can be sinless. And the idea of original sin, he says, as the church has always defined it, I could have a few things to say about that, but, the idea of original sin, depending on how you define it, and yes, the traditional view that man is born with some kind of change to his nature. I'm not going to say much about that because it's not the pressing issue here, but I'm fine believing these things people say, like a sin nature, that's a popular belief, a sin nature or original sin. I'm just not convinced that the Bible says anything about that. I don't find this concept of a sinful nature in the Bible. Romans 5 and verses 12 to the end of the chapter doesn't say anything about human nature at all. Doesn't say anything about a sinful nature. If you got a Bible, by the way, that uses the term sinful nature, that is not what the language actually says. It usually just says flesh. And they put sin nature in the translation, but that's a theological translation and not an accurate translation. I mean, it could be theological and be accurate, but in this case, it's theological merely and not accurate. But, Psalms 51, where David says, in sin my mother conceived me, and I was brought forth in iniquity. You could debate what he means by that, but he doesn't say anything about nature. I mean, so I don't know of any passage that talks about our nature having been changed. Genesis chapter 3 is where the fall occurs, but there is nothing said about the human nature being changed unless it's implied by the change of the nature of woman in regard to pregnancy. Perhaps something with her nature changed that caused more pain. I don't know. Maybe the baby maybe instead of 9 months, it was 4 months when the baby would have been born. And so there's not a change to anybody's nature. It's just that he prolonged the birth process or time of birth or time in the womb, in utero, making it more painful when it comes out. I really don't know. I mean, I don't know what it would have been like before. Maybe there was a change to her nature as far as the physical structure of the birth canal and all that created more pain. I don't know. I don't know all that. So maybe there was some change to the nature there. But I don't know if the Bible is talking about our change of nature. Our nature can be corrupted. We could get a corrupted and evil, sinful second nature, if you will. But being born with one, I just don't know. Now, there's some difficulties with that. Now, he had asked me, one of his questions, the cross-examination, he was grilling me on, can man, be sinless? Can he obey God's law perfectly and all this? There's some difficulty there. I've always said there's difficulty there. I don't have all clear answers on all that, but we'll talk about that if we get to that point. I don't find, it wasn't a defeater for my position. Now, he mentions, does odd equal can? Now, this goes back to the argument he was making and questioning me over in the cross-examination where, well, if you ought to do something, then you have the ability. He was arguing against that because Calvinists say, no, you not necessarily have the ability. You ought to obey the gospel, but God hasn't given you the ability to. You know, so they definitely don't have this ought equals can position. It's the idea that if we say, as non-Calvinists, God says you ought to do something, like ought to believe in Jesus, ought to repent, then that means you have the ability to do so. Well, I think in most cases that's the case, but that's never been my argument. And I'm pretty sure that I said that in the debate at some point when he was asking me. My ought equals can is not my issue. I don't use that argumentation. There may be aspects of what I've said that imply it. I've said God doesn't hold a man responsible for what man does not control or what a man cannot control. So that relates to it. But I generally don't have the ought equals can ability, or argument, rather. So, Jack Dabbs in the audience, Chris Scaff as well. Let's see, let's read some of these real quick, and I'll try to be quick and keep moving to the, that's always a complaint I get. But so, Orange Oki 7 says, I don't understand how there was a change to man's nature when Adam had the same nature as we do. Well, that seems to be what I understand from the Bible. Chris Scaff, I caught in the middle of his conversation. Jack Dabbs says, some say this pain is more to do with child rearing than child birthing, if that makes any sense. In other words, that God would have been referring to the raising of children. Jamie Russell says, God doesn't say you ought to when you can't. That makes God a tyrant and the person a victim. This should be obvious. Okay, so we move on.
Libertarian free will, this categorical ability, you got to be consistent. And that's a tall order that does contradict many scriptures. So we're just saying it's not going to work. And what I was trying to also explain to people is Jesus did not prove that it was possible to obey the law perfectly. He was the only one who could do it. And so like you're getting at, these have...
Well, I don't, that's the difficulty of this. Now, so a lot of what he's saying here is, it has the background of the cross-examination when he was asking me this. So if you didn't watch the debate, or perhaps not well studied in these issues, you might not know what he's really getting at. But can man live perfectly? Does he have the ability? And if he doesn't, why is he held responsible? And if Jesus became a man and was sinless, does that prove that humanity can be sinless? There's a lot of difficulty there. The Bible is clear that no man will be sinless. No man, that is, I'm talking about mature, responsible adults, setting aside the issue of children, which I think I have, well, never mind. Let's just not go there. But the fact that Jesus was a man and obeyed God perfectly, never sinned, does that not prove that it is possible within human ability to do so? Yeah, see, that's a tough one. I know the Bible says man never will. Romans chapter 8 says, if there had been a law by which man could have been justified, then righteousness would have come by the law. Meaning, if any law could have done it, the Old Testament law would have, and since it didn't, then obviously there is no law. Man cannot be justified through his conduct, which tells me he can, or at least won't. Or his finite abilities means that he will not be perpetually sinless. Now, what I was getting at in the debate, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this moment, is at any given ability or at any given moment, man can choose to obey God or not. And it's those moments that we are held responsible for. Now, how that relates to if you live 20 years, can you not be sinless? No, I do not believe so. I think the Bible's pretty clear that there isn't any man that doesn't sin. But we're not sinning every moment of every day. Solomon says there is no one that doesn't sin. Paul said, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Jesus is the only man ever living. You know, your best heroes of the Bible are flawed. Moses, of all people, you know, he was flawed. David, a man after God's own heart, we see the big problem, and he even committed murder, right? Noah. Noah, we don't have a lot about him, but we know all of our heroes are flawed, which is why every man needs to be saved through Christ. So there is some difficulty there. If there's no change to our nature, if there is no sin nature, as I deny that there is because I don't see anything in the Bible about it, I wouldn't have any problem believing it if I could find a passage about it. But if that's not the case, if our human nature, fallen as it is, they say, is not what makes it impossible to be sinless, then why does no man ever be sinless? Well, I'm not quite sure. I think the answer is so complex. There's a lot of factors. We are creatures. There's a lot of influence of evil in our world. The devil is out there. You know, we are tempted and tried, and I think there's a lot to be said about it. So it's no simple answer, I believe, and it's not even really a easy answer. I got no problem saying that. See, here's the thing. Every theological position, no matter who you are, you've got something that is difficult for your position. Because there is always something in the Bible that makes some difficulty for our beliefs. Because the Bible is not simple in every respect. Even Peter says that about Paul's writings. There are difficult things in the Bible. Because God doesn't require omniscience about the Bible to be saved. And by the way, that's a good thing to remember. Omniscience of the Bible's teaching is not something God requires of us to be saved. No man ever has it. In other words, you do not have to be all-knowing when it comes to the Bible to serve God and to be saved. Now, the less you know, the more dangerous or the more potential you won't be, and that you won't serve Christ. But I think you get my point. Leslie Lewis says no man can ever be completely sinless. Then she says, not sure exactly about Enoch. I don't know what you mean exactly when you say you're not sure if you mean sinless. Well, as a fact, the Bible says all have sinned. Now, if Enoch, for example, had been sinless, there's a man who was saved through his own conduct. Now, Paul specifically denies that this is ever the case. Once again, he says all have sinned and fallen short. The Bible clearly demonstrates that Jesus is unique in his sinlessness. So every man has sinned. There isn't any man, not Enoch, not any of the great prophets, not Moses himself, that do not need salvation through Christ. That is a very clear teaching. So when it comes to Enoch, yes, he had his flaws just like anybody. And so, let's continue on here.
Gospel ramifications of this conversation.
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly my point. And I remember I was on Leighton Flowers' show. I need to get Leighton used to let me on the show all the time.
Really?
Back in the day. Yeah.
I'm hoping one day I'm a Calvinist that he likes, and we.
Well, hey man, I can actually text him. He gave me his actual number.
Can I say something?
I remember asking him one time.
This Leighton Flowers, I think and I'm not speaking about them per se, but he gets under a lot of Calvinist skin because I hear him talked about all the time. I'm aware of who he is and seen his the debates, and I've seen some of his material. But even in the debate, he was brought up, and he was brought up in other forums in which I'm talking about Calvinism. So he's brought up a lot. So,
is it possible to not sin? And he hesitates to say no. He's like, well, they'll say it's feasible, but it's not practically going to happen because we live in a sinful world. Because they know, if they say no, it's impossible to not sin, then now you're getting into, well, why is that?
Yep.
Well, because anyway, I want to get into some because AK will at least admit this in his review. He barely got to any actual footage of the debate, so I want to beat him and say we got through way more footage than he did. So let's start at this.
A constant problem I have.
This is in his opening when he defines what the will is, right? Mm-hmm. So in the chat, please let me know if you can't hear. But I think we're set up to hear. No. Okay, that is way too surface of a definition of the will.
What is it?
He played a clip, but he didn't realize it didn't play.
Let me put the screen on. Let me share the screen real quick. You know what? Did you hear that? I don't think anybody heard it. I got to go back.
Oh, okay. So you played.
Because I didn't even have the thing shared. Oh my gosh.
Oh, there we go. I'm seeing something loading now.
Okay, yeah. Okay, never. Hold on. Let me go back.
And by the way, I didn't say this at the beginning, but I have a lot of appreciation for David and Jeremiah. Nice guys. No hostility here. There wasn't when I was in the side chat over here. So demonstration that we could all have these interactions. Okay, Jack is asking me about the new perspectives on Paul. Are you talking about N.T. Wright? And if that's the case, I'm not in agreement with everything he says. Orange, I'm not really sure how to say this name, but Orange Okeet 7 says Romans 3:10 was used by Calvinists, 10 through 18, as proof of total depravity, but it doesn't say anything about total depravity. In fact, it says the opposite. It says all have gone astray, not born astray, but gone astray. But the text doesn't say anything about their abilities. It just talks about what they do. So that's arguing that passage for total depravity is begging the question, because it doesn't actually say anything about man's nature or his birth, which relates to original sin.
All right, now they should be able to.
Definitions. Okay, so the will. We talk about the will of man. What is the will?
I think I'm going to have to slow it down, because when they play my clip, the clips of the debate, they are sped up, and so they're really sped up, so I'm going to slow it down. We'll go normal here.
Simply, it is the power of the mind to choose.
Okay, we're stopping there. So his definition of the will is the power of the mind to choose. Okay. My first problem with this: there are several other constituent parts of a human being that more than the will and the mind. And the other two constituent parts, to make it very simple, is the heart or the desires and the nature. Okay. So, and I could go through all the Greek words, but there's 4 very distinct Greek words that describe all 4 of those parts. And even our classical Arminian friends would agree with us on this.
Well, so I think he's saying my definition of will was simplistic. Well, it has to be for a debate. I mean, yes, you got to define some terms, but I can't define everything. And if Jeremiah, see, here's the thing: my definition actually came from Jeremiah, and if I can, and I agree with it, I always use definitions that come from my opponent, so that it's not an issue. Now, my definition has generally been something, I think my original working definition, and I've had pretty much the same one, it's just a matter of how you word it through, for a long time now, was something like, my original definition was, the definition of will is the aspect of the mind that chooses. And then I heard Jeremiah talking with somebody, and they defined it as it's the mind choosing. So I just reworded it to fit and put both together, the power of the mind to choose. And David seemed to have an issue with it, but actually it was worded after Jeremiah's wording.
There are deeper issues going on in the human being that determine what the will does other than the mind.
Notice what he said. That's called begging the question. He said, that determine what the will does. Well, if you're using determine in the sense that it's being used in the debate and in these discussions, which is the philosophical meaning, by the way, that should be noted. Okay, so the casual meaning of the word determine oftentimes just simply means to choose or to make up your mind. Someone might say, well, I've determined to quit smoking. They generally just mean I've made up my mind, or I've even made a choice. I've determined to watch, a movie tonight. I've chosen, in other words. Well, that's not really how we're using the term determine and determinism in this discussion. We're using it in the philosophical sense, meaning to causally determine. When God is determinism is, in theological discussions, God causally decreeing whatsoever happens. He causes these things to happen. This is really what we're talking about. But when he says, well, there's a lot of things happening. In other words, he thought my definition of will was too simplistic. Well, I get it, but some things you have to be in some parts of the debate. You have to pick and choose your what to go in depth on and what not to. But when he says there's more going on, a man has a heart, a mind. Actually, in the end, the Bible really just delineates all these different aspects that are all one and the same. They're the heart can refer to the mind or the emotions. But notice what he said. He says all these determine what the will does. That's begging the question because he's a determinist. And because he believes, like Jeremiah, that these other aspects control the will. That your desires, and by the way, they have to be pressed. What desires? Because man has different kinds. He has spiritual and mental desires. He has physical desires. And so, just the idea that they have, and they have this belief that the desires in your nature are going to determine your choices. In other words, they cause your choices. And that's what he just said. But that begs the question because I deny that. Here's what I mean. And this is often what they will ask. I think, and if you'll see my discussion on total depravity with Matt Slick on this channel, he asked the same question. And you'll see what happens when I press the begging of the question. But they'll often ask, well, what caused you to choose so-and-so? Let's say AK chooses steak for lunch instead of a carrot. Okay. Well, what caused you to choose it? And I'll usually say, well, what do you mean by cause? You mean what was my reason or what determined my choice? What made it happen? Usually, and they're usually very confused when you ask that because they haven't thought about it. Because when you're talking about cause as a reason, what was the reason? Well, reasons are just the reasons are not causal. Reasons do not force your decision. Maybe the reason was because it looks delicious and I'm hungry, but I could also choose not to eat it. So the reasons are not going to cause my choice. But if by cause, when they say, well, what caused your choice, they mean determine, then they're assuming their own theology because I don't believe something determines our choice except for us. We determine our choice. The will determines the choice, and that's it. So when he said all these other things determine your choice, well, that's begging the question. He's assuming that, but that's the very thing I deny.
Yep. Actually, this is the formula. This is Philip Melanchthon, who was with Luther in the Reformation. Yep. Philip Melanchthon said this. He said, what the heart desires, the will chooses, and then the mind rationalizes.
Yeah, so here's the problem with it. What the heart desires. The heart has different desires. You have fleshly desires. You also have intellectual desires. Which can also, it could be called fleshly in Pauline language. But when I say fleshly desires, I mean desires caused by chemicals in your body, like hormones and things like that. We also have intellectual desires, like the desire to, ego and pride and things like that. We have mental desires, and I will call them mental desires. You could call them spiritual desires, the desire to please God. I mean, that's not a physical feeling in your body caused by a hormone or something. So desires come in different kinds. And to just say, well, your heart's desire will cause your choice is to ignore the fact that the will is affected in different ways. It's not affected by your desire of hunger like it would be your desires to please Christ. You got an actual physical feeling that is affecting you, but it's just different. It is different, and you can't just equate it with some spiritual desire to please Christ. I say spiritual not in a mystic sense, but like it's coming from your mind. I know Christ is good, and I know that it is good to serve Him. He deserves it. I have a desire to eat when He's called me to fast, for example, or something like that. So I'm going to please Christ. That desire is not physical in the same sense that a appetite for food would be. And just to think that they all have some kind of similar force on our will is just not true. You could have a heart's desire in the sense of a physical desire to eat, but you can ignore it. Now they say, well, if it's greater, your greatest desire, but how do you compare a desire of hunger to the desire to please Christ? Because there's different types. One is a physical feeling that arises in our brain because of how it's wired and chemically these desires come about. Could it ever be so strong that it outweighs the desire to please Christ? Well, here's the thing. That's where 1 Corinthians 10:13 comes in. Because God will not allow you to be tempted or tried beyond where you can resist the temptation to give in to these desires or pain or suffering or whatever it is. That's exactly what the text says. And so if that's the case, and David Lewis later will say, well, that passage is referring to Christians, AK. Well, okay, so Christians, according to the Bible, are never going to be tempted to sin where the physical force is coming upon them, whether it be suffering or hunger or whatever, is so great that they cannot, or that it overpowers their desire to please Christ. And yet every Calvinist admits that sometimes we sin. So it's not as simple and cut and dry as they say it is. It's just whatever desire is the strongest. It is not, if they sit and think about that for a while, they don't have all that down like they think they do.
Yeah,
So he's talking about
but
sinful
David,
man.
we're not animals. We're not determined by our desires, AK would say.
Yeah.
And when I was talking about will, the moment of choice, I'm saying, yeah, because reasons determine our desires and our choices. And I would say reasons also touch the heart of man.
Yeah.
And so we're going to get more into this. But I loved his analogy that does not work with fasting. Because we're not denying that there's conflicting desires. We're not denying that there's conflicting reasons. And he says, see, that doesn't therefore determine your choice. And we're saying, no, one breaks through. Why do you not eat? Because the reason for fasting is stronger. And that's what
But yet, first, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that's not going to be the case, at least for Christians, right? That God is not going to cause your physical desires and appetites to be so overpowering that you cannot choose to oppose it. So if you can choose to oppose it, then it's the Calvinist that has the problem. But he's just simply begging the question in this respect too. He's just simply saying, no, whatever desire is the strongest. Well, again, desires are not of the same nature. As just what I just said. Your appetite, your hunger that you may feel, even if you're starving, is just not the same kind of pull on your mind that the desire to please Christ would be. Now, I'm not saying a Christian can't feel joy and happiness, but that's just not always the case. Sometimes you want to do it because you know it's good and He's done you well and it's the right thing to do and you have a desire, but that desire to do the right thing isn't felt in the same way a physical desire is necessarily. So he's comparing them all as if they're kind of the same. Whichever one's stronger, he says, one will come through, he says. Well, the fact is, no matter how hungry you are, God is not going to allow you to be so hungry that you cannot resist it. So you still can choose to do the right thing.
you'd call a formal cause of our deliberation. Now, that's just the broken feature in his own system, because I don't want to jump too far ahead, but I want to bring, I don't know if I can bring more clarity to the distinctions between categorical and conditional ability. Like I said, it doesn't originate with me, but there's a broken feature when someone just asserts the necessity of categorical ability. You can't answer the why questions. You can't.
Yeah. Okay, now all this stuff about categorical ability versus conditional ability, I talked about this with Jeremiah afterwards, and he admits a lot of people probably didn't understand it, and it is true that he did not come up with the terms. He recommended a book where someone explains these things, and that's fine. I may read the book. But see, I don't really have to. And we'll get into this more as he touches on it. In the end, it's all the same. You could come up with these different philosophical categories, and that's fine, but I find that they are ultimately meaningless because it all comes down to the same thing. If God has causally determined absolutely everything, unchangeably, then you are not going to do beyond what you are determined to do. And if it's sin, you're going to sin. The lost that are not chosen from eternity past, according to Calvinists, to be saved cannot be saved. It is not within their ability. They have no hope. The unelect people are born without a hope and nobody to save them. Of course, according to Calvinists, Christ is not the Savior of them anyway. Limited atonement. He died only for those he chose from eternity past to save. So those who are not going to be lost, whoever the lost are, when they are born, the non-elect, they are born without a help in the world and no Savior for them. They don't have any hope and they have no Savior. That's a miserable condition. And so saying they have no hope means simply what I've been saying, that they cannot do anything other than what God said that they're going to do. And God is ultimately holding man responsible for what he controls and decides, which is an irrationality. You see, you can come up with these terms, but it's still going to be irrational. Now, the last video I posted was only a few minutes, 5 to 7 minutes, and I took a portion of where I was grilling him on this categorical ability versus conditional ability. And I stopped it at moments and he made sure to use his words, and I showed how it does not work. It's still the same thing. You still got the same problem. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And Chris Scaff says, it's kicking the can down the road. I usually say it's just you're putting an extra step between you and the problem, but you still got the problem. It's still there. You're just distancing yourself from it by one domino. But yeah, kicking the can, they're just kicking it down, deal with it later kind of thing. But the problem is still there. And so I recommend anybody go to that shorter video I got. And I think it's called Compatibilism, or 1 Corinthians 10:13, a problem from compatibilist and determinist, because it is. But yeah, Jamie asks, are saved babies or damned babies the ones that get aborted? Calvinists have a hard time. They can't really get in unison on this. They'll answer it in different ways. Some will say that the only babies that die are the saved, are those that God is determined to save. A non-elect baby will never die. Some will say, Matt Slick will say, yeah, you could send some babies to hell. You get different answers.
So we'll get more into that.
Yeah, because so I'm understanding your distinction between categorical ability. Categorical ability, the term categorical means it's just only one thing. There can be no distinctions. So the one thing is you have to be able to choose A or B equally.
All things being equal. And check this out, categorical.
Yeah, so he's explained this a number of times now. All things being equal. It's completely irrelevant to anything I've ever said in my life. I don't believe all things are equal. I don't believe all desires are equal. I don't believe all abilities are equal. It's not really the issue. And he says things like this a lot, where, man doesn't determine the same way God determines, but I never said that they did. I mean, that doesn't matter to me. I didn't say that he determines in the same way. It doesn't matter. It's just the fact that God unchangeably determines, however he determines it. Every choice man makes is necessitated by God's determinism. That's the issue. That doesn't matter if we determine things in the same way. All things being equal, it doesn't matter whether things are equal or not. The issue is still the same, that God has unchangeably decreed every motive, thought, and intent of your heart, making him ultimately responsible logically. That's the problem.
Categorical ability is libertarian free will.
Yeah.
Now, I was being very strategic, using categories, thinking AK probably doesn't know, because I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of formulating a question simplistically, and especially in his first question about 1 Corinthians 10:13, because he thought he had a silver bullet. But what he's doing is he's assuming his position, and he'll say,
thought I had a silver bullet. Well, I think what he means is, I thought I would just completely have him stammering and stuttering. When I debated John Crawford, and you don't get this every time, but in the cross-examination, I had him completely turned around backwards. It's not me so much, it's just a really bad position that he has, and he wasn't good at defending it, and didn't know and thought through all these things. And so people make reference to John Crawford in that issue, and I think what he was talking about is, like, I was wanting something like that. Well, the fact is, I don't have an expectation that you're always going to get a person completely with their head spinning. But that doesn't mean you can't demonstrate the foolishness and the error of what they're saying. And so he says, like, sometime later, he says, I didn't get that sting. Well, you know, a lot of people can say anything. Now, here's what I'm going to say. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the reality is you're never going to get the sting from someone who always can say something to your question. No matter what the question is, they can pull something out and say it. Well, I mean, I believe all this stuff about categorical ability and conditional ability that Jeremiah was going on and on about ultimately means nothing really and doesn't avoid the problems that are still plain and evident of his theology. But saying all this stuff that's new terminology to me and new terminology, I understand it. And I understood, for the most part, I understood what he was talking about. I just never heard the terminology. But you could say all that and you're not going to get a sting even if the person's answers are wrong, because people have to take the time to dissect what you're saying anyway. But I kept grilling it, and I chose to grill it for 18 minutes, I think it was, because I knew that his answers were problematic. And I knew because it was fast-paced and he had an answer for everything, but I knew that his answers were problematic, and I knew that anybody watching could slow it down and pause it, and ultimately I could break it down in my video reviews and show how problematic it was. And if you watch the shorter video that I did, you see exactly that. When you could stop and think about the answer, you think, that doesn't work. And so I'm fine with his answers. I might not get the sting in the sense of, he's turning purple and falling over because my questions were so fantastic. Sure enough, but I still got what I was looking to get, which was answers that demonstrate the problem of what he's saying.
I wasn't assuming, but I was presupposing libertarian free will. I'm like, this is not going to go down how you think.
Yeah.
This idea about me presupposing my position behind my questions, no, actually I'm using an argument. My argument is that assuming his position, the conclusion is irrational. If, for example, when he says that God doesn't react, and I say, well, let's use another example. I can't remember exactly always what example I used in my questioning or in my arguments. Well, 1 Corinthians 10 are the passages about God. It never came upon God's heart that they would sacrifice their children. And these different passages that become irrational, he would say, well, he's just presupposing libertarian free will. No, I'm assuming in my argument your theology. The irrationality comes from assuming your theology. The text doesn't have a problem with my theology. 1 Corinthians 10:13 or any of the others. Matthew Hatchett in the side chat, nice to see you there, Matthew. He says, I think the categorical ability and conditional was just a way of dodging the question for the purpose of the debate. I think he thought he was talking over everyone's head. He was talking over everyone's head. I think he does acknowledge that, as we talked about it beforehand. And I don't think he was trying just to, I think ultimately Jeremiah wants people to understand him. He just knew that they wouldn't. But he does concede several times right here, Matthew. Now here's the thing. His strategy here was to use terminology that I'm not familiar with, and so that I cannot, so that I cannot have the advantage, which is fine. If you do utilize advantages like that in a debate, but this was not the better ones. What I'm saying is, his advantage here, or my disadvantage, was just terminology that a lot of people don't know. And so I didn't know it. Once you break down what he's saying, I understand exactly what he's saying. It's the same thing the rest of the compatibilists say. He's just explaining it in a way that's just not like everybody else explains. And so his advantage here, and he said as much on the phone, was he didn't want to make it easy for me and just use arguments and word things in ways in which I was extremely familiar with. Well, that's fine, but ultimately you're demonstrating that what you've done here is not a big plus for you, because all you've done is approach a person with unique terminology so that you're going to slow him down in the debate because he's got to dissect the terminology to understand the concepts. So ultimately, you haven't demonstrated that he doesn't understand the concepts or that he can't poke holes in your theology. You just demonstrated that he isn't going to do it real fast because he's got to get through my terminology that he's not used to. So, for example, with John Crawford, I didn't use complicated terminology that he wasn't familiar with. I just simply talked about the concepts, pretty easy ones. I even used his own analogy. I talked about the woman who touched Jesus' garments. The definition of, I was asking him for his own definition of work and then using it against him. And because he hadn't thought through these simple, basic concepts that he should have if he's going to debate about them. But that would be different if he had, and I sprung on him just terminology that he wasn't used to, and I slow him down when he's grilling me. You see, ultimately, Jeremiah isn't demonstrating the strongest part of his theology. He's just demonstrating that I'm going to have to take some time to break through some unique terminology. In other words, he's not demonstrating the strength of what he believes or the weakness of my understanding of it, just the strength of unique terminology. Not unique to him per se, but terminology that isn't used often. And he's not demonstrating the weakness of my theology or my understanding of his theology, but the weakness of my familiarity with terminology that isn't used that often. But you haven't said much in a debate if that's the case. You haven't really done much. The best option, ultimately, is when you're saying something the other person is extremely familiar with and you're able to poke holes in what he believes, or able to show that his questions don't do any damage, even when he knows exactly what he's asking and he knows exactly what you're saying. That's when you've done the best. Now, I'm not saying you can't use terminology somebody you're debating isn't familiar with, but because that does happen. And I'm not saying you can't take advantage in a debate if they're not all that familiar with what you're saying. But just of categories that I'm not familiar with, that's fine. But it ultimately is not the strength of your position, if that's what you're doing. And this is his ultimate strategy going in. So.
That's how we see ability. He's assuming libertarian categorical ability.
Orange says, what I really thought was ridiculous is when he said God says things so it understands, says things so it's understandable to man. To me, that implies that when God says things to man, he doesn't really mean what he says. Well, that's ultimately the problem of what he was saying. Now, it is true that God says things in a way man understands, but what God says is still true. Now, see, that's the issue. Now, it is true that God condescends in his language. He does use anthropomorphic language. For example, when it talks about God being a man or using he pronouns, not to get into the pronoun discussion, obviously God is not a man per se, and he's not a he, but he's got to use some human language. When it talks about God having eyes or hands, God doesn't actually have literal eyes or literal hands, but it's got to use those things so that we can understand. So that much is true. But what you're getting at is true. What Jeremiah's argument ultimately is that God simply uses language that we can understand when it simply is not the case at all. So, for example, when it talks about God reacting, that was one of the issues. He's saying it was anthropomorphic. God is able to relate, but it isn't exactly the same. The problem is, it's fine, and it's agreed by all that God uses anthropomorphic language. Anthropomorphic language is when God speaks of himself as to have human features, like hands or eyes. He's speaking of himself as a human or with human abilities or human features. in order to communicate to us. Because if you don't talk about God's eyes, then what are you going to talk about? So it is true, it's figured. Now, this was problematic for him because he kept saying it's literally true. No, it's not literally true. He doesn't literally have eyes. God is not a human. If he has eyes, then somebody had to make those eyes. No, it's not literally true, but it is true. It is figuratively true. To talk about God having eyes simply is a way of talking about him seeing. And it is true that he sees. But the way Jeremiah argues is that actually he doesn't see at all. And it's anthropomorphic language to communicate to us in a way we can understand and relate to God, but ultimately he doesn't actually see in any sense. Then the language is false and deceitful. This is what he said about God reacting. Well, it talks about God reacting because it's anthropomorphic. You know, it's trying to communicate to us. He doesn't react like man reacts. Well, nobody said first that man and God react in the same way. But two, but God does have to be reacting in some sense, or it is not true at all, even if it's figurative or anthropomorphic. Yes, it's true he doesn't react like a human reacts, but he does react. And if he doesn't react at all, which is exactly what Jeremiah believes, then the passage or the anthropomorphic language is false. That's the way that works.
And so you notice I always said no. Like I answered this question, and then I would just qualify it with man doesn't have categorical ability. And so I'm starting to rationalize his faulty question. Mm-hmm. And that's why we spent, David, 18 minutes on one question. He broke his own rule. And I was thinking, I can go all day. I will explain and nuance every single time you ask this.
Well, you may be able to go on all day, my friend Jeremiah, but that doesn't mean your answers were doing you well. And I think my video that I posted demonstrates that. A lot of it was just circular and redundancy. But this idea, now let me explain something by that. This idea of my own rule. Now I did say that I'm going to try not to spend so much time on one question. Well, that's true. Sometimes I make that my agenda, and I can have a problem with that. But, I'm only half serious about that. And I'm going to stop talking about it because, he keeps making this comment several times. But, I'm not really that bothered by spending a lot of time. Now, there are some questions where I would do better spending time on other questions. And so even though I did, again, half serious, so you see how much time I spent on one question? I was perfectly fine. The truth of the matter is spending 18 minutes on that question. I wasn't struggling to ask questions. And we weren't going in circles. I was causing him to have to show the problems of his answers. And I was fine going on for 18 minutes. I'm all for spending a lot of time on a question if I think it's got a lot of mileage, and that one did. So my comments about, you see how much time I'm spending, I spend too much, half serious. Some truth to that. Sometimes I do. The first question I could have spent less time on because the one like the question about 1 Corinthians 10:13 did a lot better. But I did make my point. And I did stay true to that, my own rule, as he says. When I asked him about God decreeing people to sacrifice their own children, he says, well, it didn't come upon his heart in the way the text says. And I said, well, did he decree it? Yes. I said, all right. Because I think that's all that needs to be said to show the problem. So I was okay with 18 minutes. And I kept my questions at the heart of the issue. I didn't allow him to just elaborate on the definition. I think one time I asked him to define compatibilist or conditional ability versus categorical ability, because I wanted to make sure the audience could hear some of the definition. But I wasn't going to grant him questions that would allow him to get all sophisticated, because I knew down in the basics of what everybody can understand are the problems. It's kind of like when you're talking about, well, let me not go there for now. But I just want everybody to know I was fine, because at the end of the day, his answers showed problems for his theology. For example, when he would say, I would say, isn't it true? Like a lot of times in his answers, he would do what Calvinists often do, which is say, well, man acts according to his desires. And I would say, okay, wait a minute. But you believe God determines his desires. And he would say, and it's compatible. Well, see, there's the problem, first of all, because I didn't ask if it was compatible. Fine, if it's compatible, that's begging the question. I mean, I'm asking you to affirm if it's true or not. So then we could deal with whether it's compatible. But instead of answering, oftentimes he would just say, it's compatible. Didn't ask if it was compatible. Is it true? And so ultimately he would say, man determines and God determines, but not in the same way, but it doesn't matter. I didn't ask if it was the same way, but is it not true that man's determined choices are what God determines for them to be? And at one point he said, so he concedes that yes, man's desires are determined by God. He said both are compatible. Now notice the redundancy. Both are compatible. What does that mean? God determining man's desires. Man desires things and God desires, but both are compatible. But man's desires are what God determines for his desires to be. So ultimately what you have is, what he's saying is, God's determining of man's choices is compatible with man's God-determined choices. Yeah, that's redundant. It's just saying the same thing. You're not saying anything. That's why I say, he was using all this terminology and he could answer it for 18 minutes, but it was meaningless. The problems are still there. The irrationality is still there. I'm just trying to show the basics, or that the irrationality is in the basics of his beliefs, despite his terminology, you see. Yeah. I mean, Jamie says, don't forget, God also says God desires man to do other than what man often does. And that's true, but see, it's a bunch of confusion.
Same question.
Yep. Well, I have a really good analogy to explain categorical. Okay. What's the other ability?
Conditional.
See, that tells you how good I am on the philosophical side. I mean, I know the stuff enough to track it.
But it's okay.
I'm more familiar with Jonathan Edwards, the natural ability versus the moral ability.
Perfect.
Which I think is a similar idea. So, but here's
Definitely.
Here's how I explain this to people. Imagine you walk.
So that's the more familiar terminology, natural versus moral ability. But again, his strategy, Jeremiah's, was to use terminology that would slow me down because I wasn't used to it. But as I belabored the point earlier, that's not when you're at your best. When you're at your best is when your answers are expected by the other person and you're still making it tough on him.
Up to like a cafeteria style buffet, right? Mm-hmm. And there's two options. Option one is surf and turf, and it's like this great steak and lobster, right? Option two is a vat of dog diarrhea. It's bubbling and it's nasty and it's disgusting, right? Now, do you have the ability to choose either one of those options? Yes and no.
Correct.
Okay. Yes, in the sense of, and I think you could call this categorical ability, you could choose either the dog diarrhea or the surf and turf. Like, you have the ability in the sense of, you could pick up the plate, you could walk up to the server, and you could say, please put the dog diarrhea on my plate, right? Or put the surf and turf. Okay, so in that sense, that's what Edwards would call natural ability.
Absolutely.
Like, you don't have a defect that somehow prevents you from making that choice, right? Yep. But everyone remember Fear Factor with Joe Rogan? Remember people would be offered, which I would do this, by the way. You offer me $50,000, I'll try to eat anything you put in front of me, okay? Anything, okay? I can keep it, as long as it's not going to kill me, you know? Anyway, so remember Fear Factor. There was stuff that they just couldn't eat. As soon as you put it to your mouth, you would puke, right? As soon as you smelled it, right? So in what sense do we not have the ability to make one choice over the other? Because of our nature.
Can I chime in real quick, David?
Yeah.
So it's this idea of, well, what he's getting at is this. We have, and he's using different words for what Jeremiah calls categorical and conditional ability. David's using natural versus moral. And the analogy he's giving is, you have this physical ability, this natural ability to eat dog excrement. But you're so repulsed by it that you're not going to. And this is kind of what they say about lost sinners, that God has not caused to become Christians or regenerated, that they are born with this nature that despises God, like we have this natural detestation of dog excrement. And that's why sinners cannot come to Christ or believe the gospel unless God irresistibly causes them to have faith. So the sinner can't. No man can. Every man's a sinner at some point before he becomes a Christian. So no man on his own can choose to love and follow and believe in the gospel of Christ because his nature is repulsed at Christ. They say this is the nature you're born with, every man, like we are naturally opposed to dog excrement. But there's so many problems with that. First of all, God is determined whether you will or not. God can determine for you to choose contrary to your physical nature. So it's not about what your desire is. It's not about your strongest desire. It's about what God has determined. And anyway, God has determined your desire. So it all falls back to God. God is the one responsible for your choices. I mean, it's that simple. It doesn't get any more complicated than that. God is the one that chooses whether you are repulsed. Who chose your nature, in other words? They say you're born with a God-hating nature. Those are their words, not them particularly, but Calvinists. You are born with a God-hating nature. Well, who chose your nature? It wasn't you. So who's responsible for you hating God? God is, according to Calvinists. That's the problem. And then he holds you responsible for hating him, when he's the one that gave you the nature to hate him. You see, that's the irrationality. That's the meaninglessness of all this. And anyway, it doesn't matter how strong your physical desire against dog excrement, God can decree for you to do it anyway. But here's the other problem. So natural, moral, categorical versus conditional, they're saying you have this ability. So in other words, everything about your physical makeup is able to do the right thing and please Christ, for example. Natural ability. In other words, it's. Let me use another analogy. It's like you have a hammer available to you. So, to hit a nail, you have to drive the nail into the wood. You have the physical ability because you have the hammer. God has supplied the hammer and it's right there. So that's your natural ability. You have the ability within your functional abilities, if you will, to obey the gospel and do what's right. But you don't have the moral ability, they would say. You're disposed to hate God just like you hate the hammer. So spiritually, your heart, you are sinful. And so you hate God. Therefore, in the analogy, you despise picking up the hammer. You have the ability to do it, but something's lacking. That's what they said. But see, if God has not given you the mental or the spiritual or the whatever ability to pick up the hammer, then the ability the functional ability is meaningless anyway. It doesn't mean anything. So God has given you the hammer, but has not in other ways allowed you to use it. You see, that's the way that works. It's exactly contradictory what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says. That you do have the ability to endure temptation. So when we sin, we could have chosen not to. We did have the ability. We could have utilized the ability. But Calvinism says that God decrees everything. So if you do succumb to temptation and sin, you couldn't have because his will is unchangeable, you see. Actually, you're assuming libertarian free will. No, actually, I'm assuming for the sake of argument, compatibilism. The rationality comes from assuming your position. It's your position I'm assuming behind my argument.
And I love the scenario you painted because this would not be categorical ability. Categorical ability says all things being equal, I can choose A or B. So what you do is you run a scenario and say, okay, I can choose A. That's categorical ability. Yeah. You run the same case scenario and say, I could choose B. But here's the thing. When we ask the deeper question, because we're made in God's image, why? They can't stay with categorical ability. They have to fall onto what we would all say is conditional ability. Well, because I had a reason for going against my desire to win $50,000 in Fear Factor. And so you've left any true reason to try to fall back on categorical ability. You've fallen on what's conditioned. Yeah. And what's conditioned is there's a chain of sequence. There's a chain of cause and effect. You have efficient cause, which as reformers we say is God. But man can formally deliberate, compare and contrast reasons, influences, our desires, a determining factor. And then
you can formulate and reason. Did everybody hear him? You can formulate and reason. But who determines how you're going to formulate? Who determines in Calvinism what you formulate, how you formulate, and what and how you reason? God. What he calls the efficient cause. And if it's unchangeable, then you do not have the power to reason and formulate other than what he determined for you to do. It's the same inescapable problem. It is unavoidable. It is logically unavoidable by our Calvinist friends. They cannot escape it. This is why Calvinists such as Piper and MacArthur will say, I don't know how to harmonize these things.
Can materialize a choice and then produce a final cause. And so even in the scenario you're painting, all that is conditional because we don't assume the irrationality of positing a libertarian categorical ability that is not explanatory. It just
No. See, the issue is, now he said that several times in the debate, but I'm sorry, but it ultimately doesn't mean anything. It's just an assertion to say, well, you're assuming libertarian free will. You're assuming libertarian free will. No, I'm assuming yours to make my argument and showing how the conclusion is irrational. That's the issue.
Asserts all things being equal at the moment of choice, I can choose A or B. So I have another analogy of how to explain categorical versus conditional if you want me to give it a crack.
Well, let me bring this up because AK's asking a good question.
Okay.
Who determines your nature?
Okay, so I loved on his program, always ask the Calvinist who determines. So you got to think what's built in incompatibilism is an either-or fallacy. Because if we say God ultimately, efficiently determines all things, well, then they will say, then you didn't determine. And the whole...
Well, that's not. See, that's a misrepresentation. I say, ultimately, it's not really your will if everything about your will is determined by God's will. It's really his will. But I have conceded many times that Calvinists believe we are making choices, we are choosing. But I've said it a number of times, you are choosing what God determines for you to choose. My very first speech, so Jeremiah, if you're watching, you did misrepresent me here. I've said in my first speech in the debate that every choice you make is determined by God. I said that to the audience, which is a concession that we do make choices, that we do determine, although you're using determine in a different sense there. We're not just simply, determine is a philosophical meaning. It doesn't simply mean to choose. Causal determination is ultimately what we're talking about. But Jeremiah, I've said a million times, and repeatedly in the debate, that people make choices even on Calvinism. I said that ultimately their choice is really just his choice, because that is the logical extension. So it's not an either-or fallacy.
The whole premise of compatibilism is no, it's rational that I choose and God ultimately determines our nature, our thoughts, desires, everything. And they say, that doesn't make sense. And we're over here like, show us the logical contradiction because we don't see.
The logical problem is first of all, God holding man responsible for all these motives, intentions, and choices that God ultimately is the one choosing for us to make and determining that we will make and giving us no power to make otherwise. That's the problem. That's the logical inconsistency. Because you believe that we're held responsible for choices that are not up to us. So, the other problem is when you guys argue, and I pointed this out in the cross-examination, you guys speak and ground everything like moral responsibility and culpability in our choices, and you justify it. You see, when you're a compatibilist, you are attempting to justify human responsibility by saying we act according to our desires. Which, by the way, you're trying to justify human responsibility, but you'll turn around at the same time, you guys, when we make certain arguments against what God would be unjust for in your view, and you say, who are you to question God? Who are you to respond to your Maker? But you also are attempting to justify God's holding of us in judgment. Did you know that? Have you ever thought about that? When you are grounding responsibility and justifying it by saying, no, we are being held accountable for our desires, for acting on our heart's desire, you know what you're doing? You're trying to justify God's judgment and condemnation of sinners. That's exactly what you're doing, whether you think it or not. You're trying to justify God. But when we try to do that, by showing he would be unjust in your theology, you say, who are you to question God? And you say, no, you can't come to God thinking like humans. God's different. But you're not doing anything different. You're trying to ground it in a justifiable reason for God to condemn us. That's what you're doing. See, because we do recognize that there is something that man can't perceivably and conceivably understand God to be just for doing. Contrary to some of the things Jeremiah was saying there.
And so, but here's where it would be a logical contradiction, and I don't think AK grasped this, and that's okay. We're ever learning, semper reformanda.
Mm-hmm.
But if we deliberated, made choices identically the same as God, there is a contradiction. Because the way that we would make someone else...
No, I never said identical. It doesn't matter if it's identical. I don't even know what that means, identical. We choose with motives and intentions, and we have reasons, and there are influences upon our will. And all of that is in Calvinism as well. It's not the same as God, because God doesn't have all the influences that we have on us. He doesn't have the temptations that we have on us. He doesn't have an infinite willpower. I mean, God is so much greater and beyond what we are, but he's still making choices. And the issue is not whether we choose identically, Jeremiah, to God. It's that we choose as necessitated by what God determines for us to choose. That's the whole issue. It's like everything you're trying to do is just not deal with that issue. Yeah. Jamie says, I feel like they are saying God is evil, but it's okay, bro. Of course, the Calvinists would never say God is evil. But I get the comedic point. Because ultimately what they're saying is when we say that God would be unjust for doing things like they say that he does, he says, you can't judge God by, you can't come up on a human level and look at him in a human light and judge him according to human standards. Well, if that's the case, then God could do anything, and you could say the same thing. God can make an immortal baby and just pass it through a meat grinder repeatedly for 500,000 years, which to us would just make him a moral atrocity. And obviously the Calvinists would not believe such a thing about God. And Calvinists wouldn't say that God would never do something like that. But then Calvinism's also relying on their own understanding of morality, right? Because the truth is, these arguments that Jeremiah has made, I don't come up on a human level and look at God like a human. If it's true, then God could do anything that we perceive as morally reprehensible, and you say, well, yeah, but he's God. I mean, you can't judge him according to our standards. It doesn't work like that. Jack Dabbs asks, AK, doesn't the C.S. Lewis quote go well here? If we can't say that God is good, we don't know if we're worshiping an all-powerful demon. I believe so. In other words, if we can't use human understanding of goodness when we're looking at God, then sure, then we couldn't say he wasn't an evil demon. Because, well, how could we say that? Well, because demons are evil, we might say. Yeah, but they're evil to us. But if God's morality and justice and goodness is something that we can't compare to what we perceive as good, then it could be a demon and say, yeah, but I am really good. I'm a demon and I'm good, but it's going to seem evil to you when you're using human reasoning and human standards of morality. but that would be the case.
Choose to do something would be by force, coercion, manipulation, and we'd be wrong for it. And so when we make the necessary distinction with God, we're saying the way that God interacts with his creation by sustaining the universe by the word of his power, it's different. It's of a different kind. Can we use human language to try to talk about a truth that transcends our reality? Absolutely. We're going to get into anthropomorphisms and analogical language. Man, I had this in the back pocket to drop on AK, and his head would have spun again. That's okay. We'll get into that. So, yeah.
I missed the part where my head spun. Now, I saw you in the debate, Jeremiah. Now, listen, this is a little teasing back and forth, I suppose, but I saw you being redundant and circular and begging the question. I didn't see my head spinning. It probably needs to. I got some neck problems, though. But it didn't happen yet.
I love it. I want to tell people, if the Arminian Pelagian says, well, who determines your nature? Ask him, are you talking about ultimately or conditionally? And then watch him look at you like, you're making up stuff. And it's like, hey.
Well, I don't think ultimately or conditionally. I mean, ultimately, I know what that means. Yes. Who determines it unchangeably is what I would say. That's what I'm getting at. Ultimately, yes, ultimately is what we're asking. Who ultimately determines your nature? Because he's the one responsible if it is an unchangeable decree. See, you cannot get out of it. Now, on one program, somebody had a good example. Charles Manson. Now, Charles Manson didn't kill any of the people that were killed by him. He had his zombie women followers do it. His brainwashed, simple-minded followers kill them. But we put Charles Manson in jail even though he didn't do it. Well, because he's responsible for it. You see how that works? All right, I'm going to read this quote by Jack Dabbs from C.S. Lewis. Now this is from C.S. Lewis, quote, if God's moral judgment differs from ours so that our black may be his white, we can mean nothing by calling him good. For to say God is good, while asserting that his goodness is wholly other than ours, is really only to say God is we know not what. An utterly unknown quality in God cannot give us moral grounds for loving or obeying him if he is not, in our sense, good. We shall obey, if at all, only through fear, and should be equally ready to obey an omnipotent fiend. The doctrine of total depravity when the consequence is drawn. That's a great quote, and it's exactly the point. If we cannot measure him by human perception of goodness, what we call good, like decreeing, when we say that it's unjust to unchangeably cause every choice and motive a person makes and then hold them responsible, if you cannot call that unjust because, we're humans and we're using our reasoning, then you can't say anything about God is good or evil, all of it means nothing. And so it's ultimately the case. Charles Manson is held responsible, even though he didn't actually do any of the killing, because he was the origin of the influence and plans for them to do this. Why was David held responsible for murdering Uriah when David didn't go anywhere near Uriah when Uriah was killed? It was the enemy soldiers that killed him, because David was the man behind the plan. David was the man behind the plan. It originated in his heart for Uriah to die. So he's held responsible. That's why. And guess what? You know why the soldiers and his generals also would have been held accountable? Because they had the choice not to obey David. So
These categories matter because I refuse to assume the faulty premises of your worldview. And so that's why AK...
Yeah, but I assumed for my arguments your worldview and showed how they were rational. You see, this is how it works. Ultimately, I did say if libertarian free will is presupposed, there's no irrationality. But what then I didn't do? I then presupposed your theology and showed that that was irrational. When it says in John chapter 5, that Jesus says to these unbelievers, he says, I say these things so that you may be saved. But then later it says, you are unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. And I said, well, that kind of makes sense, just presupposing libertarian free will. But then what is my argument? But let's now presuppose compatibilism, that God determines every mode of choice, all this about them. so that they are unwilling because he determined for them to be unwilling. It is an unchangeable decree, so they can't be willing. There's no power for them to do it, even if they wanted to. They don't even have the power to want to. Of course, that's what willing means anyway, right? So then I got to ask the question, how may they be saved by the things that he says if he determined for them to not be saved by the things that he says? That's a contradiction. You see, the irrationality, Jeremiah, is presupposing your theology, not mine. Your theology. No, but that's categorical ability. Doesn't matter. I reject that those categories mean anything. What I said makes sense. It is a fair representation of your theology. You see, I don't have to use the categorical descriptions anyway, because what I said is true. That's what matters. You can say, well, this is not this category, Calvinist. You can say, well, that's categorical ability that you're talking about. Is what I'm saying true? It is true that they cannot be saved by the things he says because they don't have the nature. They weren't born with the ability to control their nature or the nature to do so. They have no human power to be saved by the things he says. It's only up to God. So then when Jesus says, I say these things so that you may be saved, but they can't be saved by the things that he says, so that doesn't make any sense. That's irrational. It doesn't matter what categorical descriptions you throw on it. What I said is true. It is true argument. It's a logical and valid argument, and the conclusion is true.
Get to the sting that he wanted in asking his question, because I was going to make him define terms, and I listened to his...
Yeah, well, so Chris Scaff asked, what is the value of just a puppet? Well, ultimately nothing. And Calvinists will say, we're not puppets. Well, I guess we're meat puppets. But see, I never understand why Calvinists object to the puppet analogy when the way they interpret the potter and clay analogy in Romans 9 is just as bad, if not worse. I mean, what are they so offended by comparing our relationship to God as puppets when they use the potter and clay analogy the way they do? Now, if you use it in the right way, you don't have this problem at all, but the way they use it is just bad. I know one universalist that's not credible in the least, Martin Zender, but influential nonetheless. He didn't like my use of, I forget what you call it, those puppets on strings that you make. And he criticized it, but his understanding of us is the Calvinistic interpretation, even though he's not a Calvinist, it's the same belief, as what the Calvinists understand the potter and clay analogy in Romans 9. That makes us just as bad, if not worse. At least puppets look real and look like they got life form, you know.
Late review, he totally misrepresented what I said. He said, see, Jeremiah said that you can conditionally choose against what God predetermines. I never said that. Go back and watch. It just showed me he didn't understand, and I'm okay with that because...
Well, getting through the confusion of this new terminology is different because, so I might struggle understanding something that you say, perhaps, because you're saying that's categorical ability. We have the conditional ability. When the truth is, you could just leave those things off and you could actually get to the simple truths of your theology, which is what I do. The simple truth of your theology is that God unchangeably decrees through means that are also unchangeable and just as powerful every motive, intent, and thought of a man's heart. And so that the man only does that, and God holds him responsible, and all that is irrational. See, that's the simple truth. I don't need all the sophisticated categorical terminology of your presentation. I just don't. It's the truth is still there. Yeah, Jamie, I think I like Ace Theo. You know, I don't like his theology, but I like talking to him a little bit. And some of you don't know who these guys are, and that's fine. But Martin Zender, he is laughable, and he is. I can't take him seriously. I mean, he's not good at arguing anything. He's afraid to debate anybody that could give him a challenge. Ace Theo at least called into the program. You know, Ace Theo will talk with you in public. Martin Zender, not so much. He's a spiritual coward.
David, some people said, Jeremiah, I wasn't really quite getting what you were saying. And I understand. the nature of a debate. You can't always speak on that level that everybody's going to understand. Because I know AK is. Well, I'm going to speak a level above that and make him run in circles, trying to figure out where he's at.
Yeah, but what are you ultimately doing, Jeremiah? If you're making me run in circles, it's just because of the unfamiliarity with the terminology that you're using. And yes, how you explain it. David said, well, I understand natural and moral. Those are the categories I'm familiar with. And David says they're similar to what you said, and you didn't deny it, because I understand it exactly the same myself. So yeah, I was trying to get through your these categoricals terminology that you had, and the way that you were explaining it, but you're making a man run in circles just because he's not as familiar. Make a man run in circles when he knows exactly what you're talking about and still running in circles. That's when you're at your best.
And that's just the nature of it sometimes. If you go watch a James White debate or William Lane Craig, you're going to be introduced to new ideas. And God willing, go look into those things and learn.
And by the way, run in circles, it's interesting. But when you're the one in circles, when you say, well, a man's desires are determined by God, ultimately, unchangeably. And then that's compatible with God determining that. Well, that's a circle. That's redundancy.
Grow. So AK did exactly what I thought. It just worked out even better because I knew it was going to take me about 10 minutes to explain to him the difference between categorical and conditional. But David, it went 18 minutes, and we were just on repeat mode. And I can do this all day. I still got more bullets left in the chamber if he wants me to keep explaining these.
Yeah, so Jack Dab says, kind of wish I hadn't heard him admit that he's simply trying to waste AK's and by extension our time. If you know your view is right, why not get to the point where you show it's right? I think this is what he concedes, that this was his ultimate strategy. Now, there's some of that anybody would do. You know, if I know that the best arguments are the ones that he hasn't got as well, I'm trying to poke hole in his theology. But if I'm simply trying to spring on him philosophical categories that he's not familiar with, when ultimately they're kind of the same as the ones he's familiar with, like natural versus moral, and when ultimately the truth of those categories ultimately leads to the same thing, then yes, it's just kind of a waste of time.
Well, let me throw a comment up here because you said that the Pelagian Arminian will say you're just making stuff up. Well, here, they are artificial extra-biblical philosophical concepts.
Oh, like libertarian free will that your boy defended?
Yeah, or here's the other thing I bring up, though. So are you a Trinitarian? I would ask this individual.
This Stinko philosopher, he's Church of Christ. So a lot of the Church of Christ will say, I'm not a Trinitarian. I believe in the Godhead, the way the King James Bible says. Okay, so
if they're saying that, because my point is, the word homoousios in the Nicene Creed is an extra-biblical philosophical concept that was used to define the doctrine of the Trinity against heretics. Absolutely. So that's that. So this is just pure.
Now, David asks this a lot. Now, here's the problem, David. To say something is difficult to understand or that it's mysterious is not the same as saying it's irrational. You see, Calvinism is irrational. The conclusions from Calvinism are irrational. Things about the Trinity are not irrational. God is not one and the same that he's three. Now, understanding exactly how he's three and how he's one may be difficult. It may be mysterious. The infiniteness of space or the immensity of the ocean when you're standing up is hard to comprehend. When you standing by the ocean, which I've never done, but people say this, and I can imagine. When you stand next to the ocean on the shore or something, and you're looking at it, and you think of how large this and how much water is there compared to you, it's a lot, and it's hard to comprehend. But that does not mean it's irrational. Calvinism goes into irrationality. The Trinity get into the difficult.
Fundamentalist biblicism, but it's self-deceptive. Well, we're not using any extra-biblical philosophical concepts. Yes, you are. That's how you interpret reality, and that's how you interpret the Bible. You have to use other words, or you just sit there and read the Bible, right? Just sit there and read your Bible to us in the debate, and you won the debate. No, you're...
No, I don't have any problem using some philosophical categories, but first, Jeremiah's are unneeded. It's just sophisticated ways of saying what the rest of them say. And two, it doesn't have to be that complicated. When I talk about the Trinity with people, I actually avoid using homoousios and hypostatic union. I mean, it isn't really all that needed, and it's not all that helpful most of the time. Now, if you're going to argue philosophically in a debate, you might have to, get into some stuff like that, but I try not to.
Actually explaining the Bible in words that aren't from the Bible. You know,
Now, David, I want to give AK props because AK is not like that. Now, AK, with all the love in my heart, he doesn't understand compatibilism. Now, I will give him he understands the 5 points of tulip. He doesn't understand compatibilism. But AK will not reason like this fellow here. He is one of my biggest haters on my channel, and I love
Oh, is he?
it.
Okay,
It only fuels the tank, baby. But AK doesn't reason like that.
All right, so let me say how I think we complement each other well because you're better at the philosophical, which I think is totally legitimate to understand this topic. I'm doing more of the ground up approach, like I said at the beginning. So here's how I would answer this question: Who determines your nature, AK? Adam.
I like it.
Adam determines your nature, and he denies that.
But who determined Adam's nature?
Okay, well that's.
Sorry, David, it doesn't work like that. You cannot ignore the whole problem. Of course, what we're challenging is in God's decree. You can't just skip the problem and say, no, let's just start here. Well, obviously, if you start arguing and you just ignore the origin of the problem and you just start here and skip the problem, well, it's going to be a lot easier. But, well, I'm sorry too, but I'm not going to let you do that. It's exactly what I was talking about with an atheist. I said, give me one example that you can point to that makes more sense with God than without God. And he pointed to evolution. I said, well, besides the fact that evolution is a theory, you can't point to it. And besides the fact that, you can't observe evolution even if you assume it's true, but it's a theory. And I'm using theory just for what it means. It isn't a proven concept. It's a theory. And besides that, the foundation of evolution assumes something it cannot prove, which is that life originates from non-life. I'm not just going to let you assume that. It's even worse in this case. The problem is, with your theology, who determines your nature? You're arguing that the justification for moral responsibility, and that is why you argue this, you're trying to justify God. And by the way, everybody needs to say that more. The Calvinist, the compatibilist, is trying to justify God, which they say we shouldn't do. But they are trying to justify God, and the way you do that is by saying, well, yeah, he holds us responsible for the choices and the sin we make according to our heart's desire, our nature. We're acting according to our nature. But see, the reason that doesn't get you out of your predicament, the reason that doesn't get you out of your problem is because you're just, as, who said it, kicking the can down the road? That's exactly what you're doing. You're kicking the can down the road. I'm going to make you deal with that can. Who determined our nature? Okay? See, because ultimately you're getting back to God determining your nature, so that makes him responsible. That's the problem. And so David just simply tries to go back right up until he hits God. Well, Adam determined our... No, it doesn't work that way. You don't get to just ignore the problem. You're going to have to deal with the problem. Yeah, but who determined Adam's nature? And by the way, who determined for Adam to sin?
That's a legitimate question.
Valid question.
And by the way, I appreciate Jeremiah stepping right on David's point, which is exactly what he does. I think Jeremiah's trying to be a little bit humorous, but he just simply does exactly what I have done, and it steps right on David's point.
Adam.
I like it.
Adam determines your nature, and he denies that.
But who determined Adam's nature?
Okay, well, that's a legitimate question.
Valid question.
But
Yes, it is. And so then you can't just say what you're about to say, which is, I'm sorry. No, now you got to deal with the legitimate question.
we're post-fall. Sorry, we're post-fall. We can't.
No, you can't say we're post-fall. But that's not the issue. I mean, this whole point is what's happening now cannot be legitimate and rational if what happened with God before the fall, because the fall itself was determined by God unchangeably.
Go back. The fall has happened, okay? And our nature is determined by our birth. That's why we need to be born again, okay? Jesus said in John 3.
Our nature is not determined by our birth. Even according to you, your nature is determined by God, ultimately. Well, it was determined by Adam's sin. Well, the Genesis 3 doesn't say that. See, here's the thing. Genesis 3 never says anything about our nature being changed. And since that's the biggest problem in the human life is the fact that he's born a God-hater by nature, well, it's very significant that God left that out of Genesis chapter 3. You know, where the consequences of the fall were? Completely left out. Hey, by the way, all of your progeny are going to be born God-haters by nature. By the way, every human that is produced from you from here on out is going to be sinful by nature and not going to be able to believe and repent, is going to be sinner by the necessities. You know, it would have been interesting for God to have said that when he was giving them the consequences in Genesis chapter 3, but it's never there.
that which is of the flesh only can do what the flesh can do. That who is of the spirit can only do what the spirit can do. So that's
But
what I say. That's
we're not animals.
no. So
That's what AK would say, is we're not animals. Our desire does not determine our nature. Hey, David, I've listened to over 20 hours of AK's content leading up to this debate. I felt like I knew him.
Yeah, you said
when he
that.
said one thing, I knew what I would want to say in exchange. Like when he brought up everything in his debate, I just thought, oh yeah, we're in for a showdown tonight.
all right, let's listen.
You know, and I appreciate him listening to my material. That is one disadvantage I have, because he had very little on anything on these topics. I think I had one video primarily that I dealt with, and that's fine. I mean, I knew that going into it, and I was okay with that. His whole strategy, though, was at taking advantage of me not being familiar with how he was going to explain things. But it didn't really stop me. As I made the point earlier, my grilling for 18 minutes was bringing him back down to earth, where his original problems are.
Some of this so we can say that we actually reviewed the debate. All right, because we're already 30 minutes in. All right.
Okay, but what about libertarian free will? Now, I will argue in this debate that libertarian free will is just a fancy way of saying real free will. I will argue that if it's not libertarian free will, it's not really free in any meaningful sense. But a definition would be that it is the ability to choose without prior or external causal determination. In other words, your choices are ultimately up to you, so that you are the ultimate chooser. Nothing outside of you is necessitating your choices. Now,
All right, so what do you say to that?
Yeah, I like his definition because it's getting into, so this is categorical ability. All things being equal, right? At the moment of choice, you can choose A or not A, or we could say A or B. The problem is...
No, it's not about all things being equal. It's about man doesn't have anything that is going to necessitate, by its effect on his will, what his choice will be. You know, so God's eternal decree, which is unchangeable, necessitates every choice that he makes, so that man's will ultimately is not in control of himself, but God. And if that's the case, it's really God's will. Man's choosing, but he's only choosing what God chooses for him to choose. Choosing for him to choose.
When we ask, why did you choose A or B? He's likely going to say, well, because the chooser chose A. And then I'm like, okay, let me back it up on this. Why did the chooser choose A or not A? Well, what he has to do, because we're talking about rationality, is he has to fall back on the conditional ability.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
because of influences, reasons, and desires. And we're saying,
No, actually, just the opposite. When you asked Jeremiah, why does the chooser choose B or A or whatever it was, and then you represent me as saying, well, because of influences, no. See, you're assuming your theology. When you say why, you have to stop and ask yourself what you mean by why. Do you mean the reasons or the cause? Do you mean the reasons or what determines his choice? I don't believe anything determines his choice. I believe he determines his own choice. The cause of the choice is the chooser. But if you mean reasons, it is not my position that reasons cause his choice. So your question is just assuming your own premises. Your question is begging the question.
aha, that's all that's sufficient for moral reason. But
Yeah.
he's left libertarianism. So I'm just saying there's a feature within libertarian free will that's irrational. And this is the thing. He says that that's the intuitive position. The intuitive position is people choose to do.
Well, Cain and Abel is a good example. Chris Scaff, God told Cain about Abel. He said, sin lies at the door and its desire is for you, and you must conquer it. And you can do well. You know, in other words, do the right thing and all will be well for you. And that's what he told Cain. But if Cain really didn't if Cain could only choose what God determined for him to choose, then God is just misleading him. God is just being deceptive.
Things because of reasons. That's what's rational. That's conditional. And that's going to fit into the divine determinism paradigm.
I hope everybody realizes, especially if you don't watch a lot of these, primarily what I'm doing in these reviews is a rebuttal. In other words, I'm not really presenting a lot of scripture for my case. That's not really what I'm doing here. I'm relying on the fact that people have seen the debate and seen my presentation, and I'm refuting what they are commenting on in response to it.
And so when they just say, well, who determined your nature? Who determined your choices? We're going to say ultimately God, but that's compatible with us.
It's not just ultimately. Yes, ultimately, first, that alone makes him responsible for it. If he's determining your nature and your choices, that makes him responsible for it.
Deliberating and choosing according to our desires, wants.
It's just like the man with the plan in David and Uriah's case was David. That makes him responsible. That's the way it works on any logical level.
the rest. And so I will say this. we have a burden of proof, and I am totally okay. I just want to encourage people, think about how God chooses is different than how man chooses. And if you hold this creator-creation distinction with every major doctrine as you're reading Scripture, there's no contradiction. And so I want to...
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah, that's huge. James White will say we have creaturely freedom.
That's fine. That's 100%.
And you, and like
You have creaturely freedom. Ultimately, this really means nothing because your creaturely freedom is just free to do what God determines for you to do. You see, everything that the creature will do is exactly what God determined for him to do. And to say that's freedom means nothing. Ultimately, you're just saying that nothing stops the creature from choosing what God determines for him to choose, which is just simply saying God does not stop the creature from doing what he determines for the creature to do. You see, because remember in Calvinism, I made this point in the debate, freedom, they try to, that's what compatibilists are doing. They're ultimately trying to say man is free when they can't justify it. Because really, even their sin is not free. You're not even free to choose which sin you commit. Did you ever think about that? In Calvinism, they will often say, you're free to choose your sin if they're talking about a lost sinner. Actually, not even. You could sin in different ways, or you could have different sins that you commit, but you can't commit both at the same time. Am I going to steal or am I going to murder? Am I going to murder that guy over here at 12 o'clock, or am I going to steal from that guy over there at 12 o'clock? I can't do both. So actually, God determines even which sin you commit. You're not even free to choose between your sins. Did you ever think about that? So I'll tell you this, my Calvinist friends, your freedom absolutely means nothing if you're a compatibilist. Freedom in your theology is absolutely void of any meaning, no matter which way you dice it.
just have to start with that premise.
Yep.
Even the freedom we have, if you want to talk about the category of freedom for humanity, is categorically, fundamentally 100% different than God's freedom.
Yes. Now check this out.
Yeah.
I do want to say, I know
and nobody ever said it wasn't. Of course it is. Of course it's different. But that's meaningless. That's not the argument. The argument is, but God determines every choice we make. That makes him responsible. That's the argument. Saying, well, but not in the same way. You don't choose in the same way. You're right. Now deal with the argument.
Is in fairy tale land, and I'm not trying to be mean saying this, is when he says God reacts to man. Well, you have a wrong view of God and you have a wrong view of man.
Well, it's the Bible that says God reacts to man, Jeremiah. It's not just AK, it's actually the Bible. Whether it's anthropomorphic or not, okay, we could talk about it. But it is the Bible that says God reacts to man. It isn't AK. When God gets angry and it says that he gets mad at sinners, or when he punishes, when God punishes you for your sin, when God brings judgment, or even when God disciplines the people that he loves, that by definition is a reaction, Jeremiah. The Bible says God reacts. So that's a problem.
I think God reacts to the creature. Now, that's important for his position because he needs man, all things being equal at the moment of choice, to be able to choose A or B. Apart from reasons, apart from who God is, there's just an irrationality there because God is absolute. And so when he goes to the Potter passage and all these things, to me, this is literally anthropomorphic, right? I mean,
okay, that is a contradiction. That's not what it means to be anthropomorphic, Jeremiah, is figurative language. For you to say it's literally figurative is a blatant contradiction. That is what he said, right? And he's talking about the passage in Jeremiah in which God says, go down to the potter's house, and Jeremiah went to the potter's house. He saw the potter making a vessel, but then the potter changed the shape in the middle of making it. Why would the potter change the shape after having already made it one shape? Well, he explains. God says, at what point will I repent of my of the punishments that I have said I will? I'm rewording it terribly. He says, how will I act? I'm going to paraphrase at least better than I did. How will I act concerning a nation? If a nation repents of its evil, I will repent of the evil I promised to do to it. In other words, the punishment. And if it repents of his righteousness, I will repent of the blessings I promised it. That's God reacting, and that's what he's talking about when he says Jeremiah.
Fundamentally 100% different than God's freedom.
Yes. Now check this out. I do want to say, I know we got some more to review, but to me, where AK is in fairy tale land, and I'm not trying to be mean saying this, is when he says God reacts to man. Well, you have a wrong view of God and you have a wrong view of man. If you think God reacts to the creature, now that's important for his position because he needs man, all things being equal at the moment of choice, to be able to choose A or B. Apart from reasons, apart from who God is, there's just an irrationality there because God is absolute. And so when he goes to the Potter passage and all these things, this to me, this is literally anthropomorphic, right? I mean, we're bringing.
Okay, he said literally anthropomorphic. It can't be literally anthropomorphic. That's the same thing as saying it would be literally figurative. No, it can't be literally anthropomorphic. I don't know what that means. See, that's one of the most meaningless statements. That's not how language works. You got figurative language and you got literal language. Figurative language is when something doesn't mean as it is literally stated. Literally, if I say, boy, I'm dying of hunger, we might say that as an exaggeration. I haven't eaten since the morning. I'm dying of hunger. Well, not really dying, but I'm exaggerating. That's figurative language. It's called a hyperbole. And to say that it's literally anthropomorphic would be to say it's literally hyperbolic. Which means what? That just so fascinates me that anybody would say that. It sounds like what the dispensationals say. You know, they have a hard time too with literal versus figurative. Okay, Jamie says, I think he was using how the kids are using it, emphasis void of actual proper usage. Yeah, well, a lot of people will use literal to mean emphasis, like I was literally hungry. And what they mean is I was really, really hungry, which is complete contradiction of what the word means. Yes. No, I really don't think he means that. Because he said it a number of times, and I believe, well, that would be the only thing that would actually make sense of it. So if I have misunderstood him, I hope that he will correct me at some point. But here's the truth of the matter. Anthropomorphism is called figurative language. Ask any person who knows what these words mean, and any professor of English or grammar or whatever. This is the way it works. Figurative language is not literal. That's what it means to be figurative. It can't be both. It has to be one or the other. But figurative language is true. Well, I mean, if it has to be either, it can still be true. So when God talks about him reacting in Scripture, Jeremiah here, his whole point is to say, well, that's anthropomorphic. Okay, and what does anthropomorphic mean? It means communicating with human. It's like saying it's just using human language. Humans react, and therefore God speaks of himself like a human, like he's reacting. But Jeremiah doesn't believe God actually reacts. And so ultimately what he's saying is God is communicating something that is false because he doesn't react. It's fine for God to use figurative language, but it still must communicate something that is true. If God doesn't react at all, then to say that he reacts in Scripture is just to communicate something that is not true. That's it. It isn't more complicated than that.
God down to be a potter over clay. You know what I mean? And so I'm going to wait. I'm going to explain to AK what analogical knowledge language is, because it's a little bit different than anthropomorphism. We have different layers of human language, and the most didactic language is still analogical.
Yep. And then my ground-up comment on this is, do we have the ability to choose without prior or external causal determination the ability to keep God's law as sinners?
Got him.
Because that's where this becomes a gospel issue.
Yep.
Because the inconsistency.
Well, you have the ability at any given moment when you're faced with temptation to do what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that you can do, David, which is you can endure it. So you do have that. Now, does man endure on a long-term basis? Well, evidently not. But at any given moment, he could have. You're not living the whole law at once. You're not living all of your choices and temptations at once. But you can endure any given moment. This is what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says. By your own admission, David, that is to Christians.
Goes, okay, so if in his position, he has to say yes, or the whole thing collapses. Well, yes, of course we can keep God's law.
And he won't
because he knows if he says no, then there's a thing causing him to not be able to make a choice.
Yep.
Which is to be sinless, or which is
That's
the whole heart
that's
of the
why
gospel.
he needs to just say yes, it's possible, highly unlikely, even in heaven, in the glorified state, which is plenty of scriptures that tell us that there will be no unclean thing, there will be no wickedness in glory. But in order to retain libertarian categorical ability, you have to be consistent and say, well, the possibility is there.
Yeah, John Frame has a really good couple pages on that in his One Systematic Theology where he lays that out well. Okay, AK, I wanted to get to this. Thank you for bringing it up. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is about regenerate believers. That's all I have to say. He keeps using that passage. And by the way, that's Tim Stratton's like AK-47 silver bullets passage. Like he goes on and on and on about for Tim, 1 Corinthians 10:13 just ends everybody. Like it's none of you Calvinists can answer 1 Corinthians 10:13. Yeah.
To me, it was so easy to not grant his worldview. Well, it says you have an ability. It doesn't say you have an ability to categorically thwart God's determined, unchanging.
Okay, first of all, when the Christians in Corinth were reading Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 13, who was there to teach them about categorical versus conditional ability? And if they didn't know about those things, and they certainly would not have heard of it, then how did they understand the passage? I think they can understand the passage because the passage is simple and you don't need all that. If you sin, or if you're tempted, whether it's through torture, suffering, or tempted through your lust, there is a way for you to get out of the temptation, or there is a way for you to endure. That's what the text says. But if you are determined by God unchangeably to sin and succumb to the temptation, there isn't a way out. It would be meaningless to say there's a way out while unchangeably decreeing that you will not take it. It's meaningless. God has created a door in the room so that you can get out, but has determined that you will not ever take the door, and therefore you can't. It is equal to say that you can't. If God has determined that you won't, then you can't. You see, God is pretty powerful. Yeah. Chris Scaff says you can't have anthropomorphic language without the reality behind it. Absolutely. Jamie says, if you can't get around it, no matter how you strain the context, it is still saying multiple possible outcomes are real, whatever the application or context. Are actually possible, not real.
Purpose. It says God is faithful. Well, okay, we have a different understanding of who God is. I'm telling you how we rationalize and understand what kind of ability is compatible with God being faithful.
Why doesn't Satan bring his charge against God of injustice? Did he not determine Satan's fall as well? I only did what you determined. Did Satan have a fallen nature from his creation? And by the way, that raises a good point that I have asked before, Chris. You know how Calvinists will appeal to Romans 9 where Paul asks, who are you, O man, to reply against God? Will the thing formed say, why did you make me like this? Well, first, I always say, well, I guess the man who replies against God is the man who's been determined to reply against God. But secondly, you see how even the question is irrational if compatibilism is true. But let's think about this. Is it wrong to ask God or to say something to God that's true? I mean, on Judgment Day, cannot the fallen man legitimately say, but you made me like this? I mean, wouldn't that be true? How would it be wrong for a man to say actually what is true? You did this to me. I couldn't do this even if it was, I couldn't do otherwise. Why did I hate the gospel and rebel against you my whole life? Because you determined for me to do. Of course, if you use the question like Paul actually meant it in the context in which he used it, it's actually not a problem. But for them it is, because it would be good and fine to say what would be true. For God to say, why didn't you obey the gospel? I couldn't. You didn't determine for me to do it.
So I could tell he was frustrated because he had that silver bullet, David, but it wasn't given that sting like he wanted. Like to me, this is one of his earliest arguments. But he broke his own rule. He took 18 minutes, and I was like, we can keep going, baby.
Yep. All right, let's go to the next timestamp I have. I want to because I don't think you addressed this, because of course there's limited time, but the chessboard analogy and then
this is one of my favorite
the firefighters burning a house down in order to put the fire out thing. So let's listen to him say that. It's a short little part. Let's see. That's 11:32. It's hard to get a precise. Here we go.
In other words, God does not need to determine man's will in order to accomplish his own. In other words, God does not need to determine the moves on both sides of the chessboard in order to win the game or to accomplish the strategies that he plans. He leaves freedom for the opponent of the chessboard, and he can still win and accomplish all his strategies.
That is a great analogy. And I wasn't the first to say it, but it's a great analogy. You see, in Calvinism, the only way God really wins the games and performs the strategies that he goes in is to determine the moves the other person makes. I can do that. And I figure that God is probably as bored. He would be as bored and uninterested in doing that as I would be in playing myself at chess. It's exactly true. See, in my view, God can let the person he's playing chess with, figuratively speaking, make his own moves without determining them. And he could still accomplish not only victory, but he could still do his own strategies. He's that good.
Now, it's important to note that
Do
Calvinism.
you want to talk about that, or you want to let it play?
I do.
Or
I
you
can
want
do
to
it
talk about
really
the chess
quick.
one first? All right, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because this is one of the easiest ones. I've heard of this years ago. Number one, notice what he's doing. He's using a human analogy between two people experience in playing chess. We don't know how the moves are going to be played out in the middle. But if you have a grandmaster chess player and you have a novice, it is certain that the grandmaster will win.
Yeah.
But what does this do? When you univocate on this human analogy with a human to God relationship, well, what happens?
Well, he's certain to win on both of our viewpoints. The grandmaster, which is God, will win, is certain to win in both cases, whether it's Calvinism, non-Calvinism. But which one says more about God in a better way? In Calvinism, the grandmaster is going to win against the novice because he determines the novice's moves. Okay, I'm going to play Bob here, and Bob's going to move to e4 here, and then he's going to bring the and he's going to do this, that, bring out his knight, and well, if you determine all the moves, yeah, he wins, and he's certain to win. He's also certain to win on non-Calvinism, even without determining the moves of the other person. He's that good. See, in non-Calvinism, God is wiser and better.
does not know the moves in the middle. And so that analogy just shows that God is not omniscient. And we'll get into...
No, that doesn't show that he's not. See, that's a misuse of my analogy. The analogy doesn't... My analogy goes towards God's ability to carry out his victory and strategies without determining the moves of the other. You can't then turn around, make my analogy start to compare something else, like God's knowledge. You can't do that. That's not the way you use someone's analogy. It wasn't an analogy about God's foreknowledge. It was an analogy about what God decrees about the choices the other person does. Jeremiah. I mean, you can if you're going to do that, you can misuse every analogy in Scripture. God compares himself to a strong tower. I can say, yeah, but a tower can be brought down by a strong enough army. So you're saying God? So is God saying that he's got limited strength against certain armies? You see, no, that's not the way that works. The analogy was not. You see, the same thing happened with my analogy, or my illustration rather, of the DeLorean, the time-traveling DeLorean, which they completely missed, and they had the same problem. They tried to make the illustration about my time-traveling DeLorean about how God learns the future, about how he knows the future. That was not what it was about. So the chess analogy is not about whether or not God knows ahead of time the moves or not. It's about whether he determines the moves and if he can win without determining the moves. And I say, yes, he can. In your theology, he determines the moves and wins. That's not so impressive. Okay, but let's talk about this because we're running out of time. They had the same problem with my DeLorean analogy. And they even kind of made fun of me a little bit. Said, Leighton's, I guess they don't like Leighton Flowers' analogies. Leighton's analogies, this makes his analogies look good, David said. Because in my debate, so let me set this up if you don't know what I'm talking about. In my debate, one of the arguments they made was about the relationship between God knowing the future choices of man and determinism. And it's a classic argument that determinists make. But it's basically that because God foreknows with certainty our choices, then you are not free to choose them. And they're saying, so if you, AK, believe that God foreknows infallibly every choice that you're going to make, then you're not really free. You can't make something, You can't make a choice other than what God foreknows that you will make. And that's a faulty way of saying it. That's the way they were saying it. And so I gave this analogy how that's not true. I said, if I have a DeLorean and I travel into next year, into the future, into next year's Super Bowl, and I see who wins, and then I travel back to the present, I now, in present time, know who wins next year's Super Bowl. I have foreknowledge of the future. But as is obvious, my knowledge of the future of who wins the Super Bowl does not determine or necessitate who wins the Super Bowl. And what is the illustration demonstrating? It's demonstrating that their argument is false to say that because God certainly knows the future, you are not really free to make other choices. No, the Super Bowl teams, the football teams were free to use their own skill and methods and play the game the way they're going to play, and that will determine whether they win. My knowledge of who wins does not necessitate it. It's still determined by what they do, not by my foreknowledge. You see, because here's the ultimate point. Foreknowledge is not causal. Knowledge is not causal. Knowing the future does not cause the future to happen. Knowledge does not have any cause and effect relation to future. And just like knowing the past does not cause the past. See, I know what choices Jeremiah made in the debate, in other words, the past. But my knowledge of his past choices does not cause, obviously, his past choices. And it's the same way with the future. God's knowledge of the future is certain. He knows with certainty what you're going to choose, but it does not necessitate what you choose. You are free to choose. You see, because God, not only does God know what you will choose, He knows what you could have freely chose otherwise to do. You see, it's that simple. I don't know why people get hung up on that either, by the way. People think, well, if God cannot be proven wrong in what He knows about your future choices, then you can't choose otherwise. No, you can choose otherwise, you just won't. What you got to realize is there's a difference between will and can't. Ability and what a person, and volition. Ability and volition are different. You see, what a person will do and what they can do are two different things. And where people get confused is they start mixing those up. What you will choose in the future is not the same as what you could have chosen. So, for example, that's often how people will frame it. They'll say, well, if God knows what you will choose, then you could not have chosen otherwise. No, you've got two different concepts. What you must say is, if God knows what you will choose, you will not choose otherwise. Now, that's the true statement. But you could have chosen otherwise. It's simply God foreknowing what you will freely choose to do. And He's certain, He 100% accurately knows what you freely will choose to do, and it's that simple. But He doesn't, His foreknowledge does not cause what you will choose. Foreknowledge is not causal. So, it's like this. God foreknows that AK could have chosen A, B, or C, whatever it is. And He also simultaneously knows that AK in the future will choose B. Well, now that we know both things about what AK could have chosen and what he will choose, it no longer makes sense to anybody to say, so AK could not have chosen A. No, we've already established that God foreknows that AK could have chosen A or C. It's simply a matter of AK will not choose A. That's what God knows. Now, yes, that's philosophical. It's part of it. But it's not complicated. A little deep. But so here's the problem with the DeLorean analogy that they had, or the illustration. The illustration was not illustrating how God knows the future. In fact, it wasn't illustrating anything about God. It was illustrating something about the nature of foreknowledge and how it is not causal. But every time they talked about my illustration, they said, so God does learn the future. God does have to look into the future. No, that's not what the illustration was saying. The illustration was dealing with the nature of knowledge and its relationship to your choices. It was not dealing with how God learns the future. I never argued that God learns the future. I believe God knows the future, but I don't believe he learns it. I believe he just always knows the future. I don't know how. But to misrepresent my DeLorean illustration as how God learns the future is to completely miss the point.
His DeLorean analogy.
Oh, yeah, the
When he
DeLorean.
said that, I thought, okay, no one can be mad at me anymore for me saying God looks down the tunnels of time and reacts to man's choice. Because that was literally his analogy. Like, anyway, I got so excited because I wanted to
See, he just did it right
say
there.
so much.
The strategies. Now,
Let's listen
now,
to
it's
it
important
again.
to note that Calvin
Do you want to talk about that, or you want to let it play?
I do.
Or
I
you
can
want
do
to
it
talk
really
about the chess
quick.
one first? All right, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, because this is one of the easiest ones. I've heard this years ago. Number one, notice what he's doing. He's using a human analogy between what two people experience in playing chess. We don't know how the moves are going to be played out in the middle. But if you have a grandmaster chess player and you have a novice, it is certain that the grandmaster will win.
Yeah.
But what does this do? When you univocate on this human analogy with a human to God relationship, well, what happens? God does not know the moves in the middle. And so that analogy just shows that God is not omniscient. And we'll get into his
Which misapplies the chess illustration, which was not about God's knowledge.
DeLorean analogy.
Oh, yeah, the
When he
DeLorean.
said that,
There it is, the DeLorean analogy. Now notice what application he makes with my argument, with my illustration.
okay, no one can be mad at me anymore for me saying God looks down the tunnels of time and reacts to man's choice.
What does he mean? Well, what he means is Calvinists often accuse non-Calvinists of believing that God learns the future by looking into the future like we would do in time travel. And non-Calvinists will often say, you're misrepresenting, that's not what I believe. And so he's saying, well, you hear AK's illustration about the DeLorean, so now nobody can get mad at me for making that accusation. Well, we can still get mad at you. Good news, Jeremiah. We can still get mad at you because my illustration was not about God, how he learns the future, or even if he learns the future at all. My illustration of the DeLorean was about the nature and relationship of foreknowledge to your choices and how it's not causal about the future. Now, it is true in the analogy, in the illustration, I do learn the future, something I did not know until I went into the future to see, and then I came back. But that's not the part of the illustration that is comparable to God. Now, God already knows the future without learning it or looking into the future. And I don't know how, but he does. That's my view anyway. The part that the illustration is comparing is simply that he doesn't determine the future simply by knowing it. So you have misunderstood.
That was literally his
both
analogy. Like, anyway, I got so
my
excited because I wanted to say so much
comparisons.
with that. But the chessboard analogy, this is why it doesn't work. Because God is the ground of all being. He sustains the chessboard.
Yeah,
you know
I
what I
was
mean?
gonna say that.
And
Yeah.
I don't grant man having categorical ability. So throw all the analogies you want, and I will show you how they are disingenuous between who God is and who man is.
Yep. So my point of that's where I was going to go. God. So in the analogy, it would be if the one chess player who's in God in the analogy is actually allowing the heart to beat, the lungs to work,
There you go.
oxygenating the air that the person is actually moving the chess pieces. Here's the other thing, and I put this. Those of you who are watching,
Well, but none of that has a problem if you understand what the chess analogy is saying. God creates the person he's playing chess with, gives them life, sustains their life, gives them a mind to reason with, but then determines what choices and what thoughts and plans they're going to make in their mind. And then when they make the choices, of course, he's right there ahead of them already. You see, the whole point is that in non-Calvinism, we don't believe God has to determine the choices of the person. That's still true, and the chess analogy still shows a weakness in your thinking.
if you go to the post that was like the event, there's a little discussion thing. I just threw a few quotes in there. But John Owen, okay, and by the way, I have a goal. I'm currently reading John Owen's works, Calvin's commentaries, and that church history set. Like I want to read like the entire thing. It'll be like the rest of my life. But anyway,
Matthew Hatchett says, I believe the Bible shows several examples of God changing his mind or reacting to man based upon what choices men make. One example is Nineveh repented and changed. God showed mercy, which is exactly what God said in Jeremiah about how he would change his reaction depending on the reaction of the nation, which was the whole point of the clay analogy. See, if Calvinism is true in the analogy that God sends Jeremiah to see at the house of the potter, If Calvinism was true, the vessel that the potter makes shouldn't change. It should have been the same vessel the whole way through. Because God already determined what it would be, and it was always the same. It was unchangeable. But why in the visual analogy that Jeremiah had was the vessel changed? Was the potter making a mistake? No, the whole point was for God to say, see, I will change what I'm doing with you. I will make you into one thing. But in response to how you behave, I may change it into another. It's exactly what God is saying, and that's exactly the opposite of Jeremiah's theology. Clint Little in the audience, he says, AK was confident and cool during the debate. I said Jeremiah would lie. He is a liar. I don't think Clint likes Jeremiah. He was flummoxed several times during the debate, but he tries to turn the thing after the fact. He is sad and worse. Loss. Well, I'm not going to say Jeremiah lied. I'm going to say that he didn't do good. Here's the thing, Clint. I believe people do lie. People out there and can be accused of lying. Just look up anybody on TBN. I just try to be very careful about, because, here's the thing, Chris. People say it about me. People accuse me of lying. David Preston, when I debated him, in one of my comments, he said, you just lied. You made that up. I actually didn't. It was just what I represented him like I honestly thought. So I just got to I'm careful with the lying thing. I don't believe Jeremiah actually did lie. I just believe he didn't do well. That's how I would say it.
Owen, so when AK makes an argument like this, and I've heard other guys, they just focus on one attribute of God, his sovereignty. Like sovereignty. Owen brings up several other attributes of God that you don't really hear. I mean, you don't really hear this even from Calvinists. What about God's wisdom? What about his counsel? What about his immutability? Oh.
Actually, David, if you remember my presentation, the very first speech, I mentioned all those things. In fact, I had it written on the screen during my projector that I included God's wisdom and all those things because that's all a part of it. I said God does not need to determine man's will in order to accomplish his own. He is powerful enough, wise enough. See, I had wise enough in there.
Okay, because all those things become in question when God has to react to human choices. And here's the other one. Address this real quick, if you will. God can know the moves without determining the person to make them. So you hear this all the time, right?
Yeah, if you assume incompatibilism.
Yes.
And so my whole point is you just don't understand who...
Well, okay, now listen. The statement the person is making is just saying what God can do. So when Jeremiah says, if you assume incompatibilism. So, well, he's making a statement about what God can do. Even David has admitted that God can do that. If you listen to our phone call, David admitted to me, Jeremiah, that God can do things without determining people. He just simply doesn't believe they are. So you must disagree with David. So, but for, actually, you don't have to, it's not true that you have to assume incompatibilism. I could assume compatibilism is true and still say God has the ability, Jeremiah, to know the moves without determining the moves. I can assume I can be a Calvinist. There's nothing saying that God has the ability to know your choices without determining them. You could say that and say, I just don't believe he does. That's not, you don't have to assume incompatibilism to say that God has the ability, just simply doesn't use it. But the real problem is you saying what God cannot do here. God cannot know, because that's what you're denying when you say, well, if you assume incompatibilism, which is ultimately to say that you don't believe that. You don't believe God can know the moves without determining the person to make them. How can you know what God could know? That's like the open theist. See, you're making the same mistake the open theist makes, thinking that you know God's abilities well enough to know what he could not do. Just like the open theist says, God cannot know free choices without of the future. He cannot know future free choices without determining them. And how in the world do you know that? Have you looked at God's brain and looked in there and you figured it out? I mean, that's awfully arrogant. And I think Jeremiah is doing the same thing the open theists do.
God is. And so we're not saying that, God doesn't have to. Well, I'm saying, but if he's omniscient and he created this world, I'm saying that has necessary effects of who God is and who man is. And so this is the thing, though. The way that this individual is using the word determine, promise you, it's the same way another human would try to determine the moves of another person. They can't.
Well, but it doesn't matter. I mean, even if it's differently, God still is doing the determining, and it's unchangeable, meaning there is no human power to do other. So all this stuff about whether it's the same or not is irrelevant, and it's just a way to get around the problem. I think the last thing I'll mention here, because I'm going to have to bring this to a close, is something that I haven't addressed too much. I just haven't seen the time to do it, I guess. Oh, let me get to it. Chris Scaff says, A.K. applied determinism to the parable of the forgiven servant. He asks for forgiveness, receives it, doesn't apply the same, and is punished. And he doesn't forgive the others who owe him. God determined is asking for mercy. He is not giving mercy. Yeah, this is not coming from his heart. And there was a lot of scriptures about free will that I could have used, but I didn't want to overwhelm Jeremiah with just too many scriptures. I don't believe in just doing so many scriptures that the other person can't possibly deal with them. But yes, everything that happens and God reacts negatively to man in the Bible, because guess what? God does react negatively and positively to things that man does in the Bible, because God reacts. Everything that God acts negatively to, all you got to do is say, well, we determined for him to do it. But so this last point that they've brought up several times, well, even in your view, AK, God created the world, so he's ultimately responsible for everything. Yes, in a sense, because God brings the world and allows sin to occur in his world, you can say in some sense he's responsible. But here's the problem. It's not really a sense that anybody has a problem with. I mean, the fact that God allows people to do wrong, really people don't have a problem with. Guess what? The Calvinist doesn't. You see, because if the Calvinist did, then he would have to acknowledge that it's an even worse thing, that God would then determine it. So we know the Calvinist cannot logically and consistently have a problem with God allowing sin. But for the Calvinist to think that we do is just simply begging the question. I don't. I don't think there's anything wrong with allowing a person to do their own choices, because, you see, when God punishes them and brings justice to the persons who's done the wrong, that's actually a good thing. It's not wrong because God makes everything right by judgment. And God will deal with every sin ever committed, every evil and atrocity that is that is not dealt with by the atonement of Christ through forgiveness. God is going to deal with it. God is going to bring justice. And what happens when the scales of justice are tipped and God metes out justice and he tips the scales back? Well, then everything's right. You see, that's the problem with what they think is a problem for us. Well, even in your view, AK, God created a world in which sin exists. Yeah, and he deals with it adequately. He punishes it and brings justice, and that's okay. There's not a problem with that. Parents ultimately know that when they have children, if the children grow and live, they're going to do bad things. At some point, they're going to make bad choices. But it's okay for the parent to allow that to happen. And especially in God's case, because whatever evil is going to occur, he's going to deal with it and bring justice to it. The problem is, in Calvinism, he's the one that determined them in the first place. And yes, it is as if a firehouse sets fire to an apartment complex and then goes and saves the people from the fire. That's a bit irrational and doesn't say good things about the fire company any more than it does God. So anyway, all right, that's my time. I mean, we only got through, we got through 40 minutes. That's pretty good for this program. I mean, we got through 40 minutes. So, David Lewis and Jeremiah, the invitation stands. I'm willing to have a discussion with you live or even pre-recorded if you want about these things. I don't believe that you represented my analogies and illustrations and arguments well. But I still appreciate you guys. And I appreciate everybody in the side chat, everybody's comments. It makes it good for others who watch later to see the comments. And the interaction is always good and helpful. So sorry that I don't do too many live programs anymore, but I just don't have as much time as I would like. But once again, I'll go out with the theme song. So you guys, God bless.
It's easy to get discouraged and think it's never going to work out.
Knowing that there is a God.